I call this meeting to order. Welcome to the 22nd of October, 2019 Planning Commission meeting. Please stand for a moment of silence and reflection. Thank you. Be seated. At the beginning of each regular Planning Commission meeting, we allow time for a comment period where anyone can speak for up to 3 minutes on any topic that does not appear on the agenda. The comment period may last up to 10 minutes, so regardless of the number of speakers. So if you have something you'd like to come up and talk with us about for 3 minutes or less, please come forward. Seeing none, we'll move on. So we have two cases that we may be able to move to the top of the agenda and go ahead and take care of and move them on out. Is there anyone here from Z2619 North Tarboro Street? Please stand up. Okay, are you here from the applicant or the public?
I'm representing the applicant.
Okay, so you asked for a deferral?
Yes.
Okay, so we will go ahead and take that deferral to the 26th of November, is that correct? All right, is there anyone else here who wanted to speak about this case? All right.
I was going to speak, but I'm fine with
Waiting to the 26th?
coming back.
Okay, great. All right, then we will defer. Thank you. All right, so that takes care of that one for today, and we'll see you back in November. The other one is Z2919, 5706 Rock Quarry Road, and 3801 and 3831 Pearl Road. Is there anyone here to speak on that?
Yes, ma'am. I'm here to speak if necessary. I am seeking a deferral until November 12th.
Okay, all right, because we don't have a CAC vote. Will that get you your CAC vote?
It'll get us our South CAC, yes.
Okay, great. Then we'll go ahead and defer that case with your acceptance.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Is there anybody else who was here to speak about that case? All right, very good. So we'll move on and into reports from the committee. So we have two items from the Text Change Committee. Mr. Mann, would you like to speak about those?
Reviewed two text changes at our last meeting. One was TC1- subtitle D18, Omnibus List Regulations. It dealt mostly with the changes that we made, dealt mostly with townhouses and cottage courts. One of the major changes that we voted on was to change the language from individual lots to interior lots in cottage courts in various sections of the ordinance.
Mr. Mann, could you make sure you're at your microphone? I'm not sure people.
Okay. And then the second case, TC719, overlay districts in recombinations, we deferred, or we made a motion to hear that case here at full Planning Commission. We just thought that it would be better if we heard it at the full commission. Anything else? I think, Keegan, do you have any other to add?
Not too much to add. I'm happy to go over the specific changes to that section 13 of the ordinance if you'd like, but
Okay.
also here to answer any questions.
So does anyone have any questions or want to hear more about TC1D18 before we entertain a motion? All right, I'll entertain a motion.
I don't know the correct language on this, what we're going to do, but it's...
So you're advising on consistency with the comprehensive plan. So if,
want to change the language from interior to individual.
oh, right.
Yeah.
Let me see if that's in the staff report. I think you can make your motion to recommend approval, if that's what you're moving for, of the text amendment as written in the staff report.
I move to recommend approval as amended by staff to change interior to individual lots within the ordinance.
Do we have a second?
Second.
All right. Any further conversation? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say no. Okay, unanimous. Moving on to TC 719 Infill Subdivisions and Recombinations. So we were unable to make a motion to recommend or not recommend at the text change committee, so I imagine we need a full discussion here so that the full committee can get involved. So, Mr. Hodge, could you please give us your presentation?
Good morning. So this text change has been in the works for a little over 2 years. It was authorized by the City Council back in October of 2017 during a discussion when the environmental characteristics for the North Hills neighborhood were being adopted into the city code. At that time, there were questions about were there other means for addressing subdivision of lots in an infill setting other than a neighborhood conservation overlay district, similarly to how perhaps the city code addressed it pre-UDO, whereby infill subdivision and recombinations were not approvable by staff. They moved them forward to the Planning Commission. As you know, site plans and subdivisions now are all administratively, for the most part, administratively approved. And so they wanted to evaluate a possible UDO text change that would incorporate more objective criteria into the code for staff to utilize. The Planning Commission has not received this until August of this year. When the council did authorize the text change, at a subsequent meeting, they actually pulled the item back and sent it to Growth and Natural Resources, and that was in the Growth and Natural Resources Committee of Council until the spring of this year. And then the full council referred this item to Planning Commission. Summer break occurred, and this was forwarded to the Text Change Committee at their first meeting following summer break. The purpose and need, again, in older neighborhoods, current zoning regulations permit recombinations and subdivisions that neighbors often deem out of context with the existing development pattern, which more recently has often led to the interest of the creation of neighborhood conservation overlay districts, majority of which in the last 4 or 5 years have been primarily targeted toward addressing subdivision of lots, minimum lot sizes, minimum lot widths. Those include North Hills, North Ridge West, and most recently Willow Run South. The text change process for a neighborhood conservation overlay district is pretty intensive for both the proponents as well as staff doing the neighborhood study. It requires initiation by majority of residents typically, and requires substantial neighborhood legwork as well as staff time and resources to make that happen. There's a adoption of the regulations ultimately into the code if the project makes it to that point, and then requires a subsequent rezoning. So typically the most expedient neighborhood conservation overlay district from start to finish typically takes about 9 months. These are some of the neighborhoods where there were subdivisions that spawned the creation. This actually says North Hills. It should have been North Ridge West, NCOD, where the lots in red were subsequently subdivided. And that's what triggered the North Ridge South NCOD. And this is North Hills NCOD, where the some of the subdivisions or recombinations herein again triggered those neighborhood conservation overlay districts that ultimately led the council to this conversation to consider a text change that would address this. This text change, if adopted, would only address the subdivisions in areas or properties that are subject to infill compatibility today. and those include R4, R6, and R10. However, R10, as I'll go over later, are expressly exempted from this proposed text change regarding subdivision. Essentially, it looks at properties that are fronting on streets that are 20 years older, so the lot itself is fronting on a street section that was installed at least 20 or more years ago, is less than 5 acres in size, is zoned R4 or R6, and a lot that's being proposed would have to meet at least 66% of the minimum lot size, lot width, and lot depth of the comparative sample lot median for the search area. The sample search area is similar to how residential infill compatibility looks at surrounding properties for context for street setbacks. It's slightly different in that it looks at vacant lots as well, whereas the residential infill compatibility street setback for buildings only looks at lots that have developed 1 and 2 family homes on them for comparative purposes. Also, this would build in some exemptions from the requirement to dedicate right-of-way as called for in the UDO, where it would look to a more context-sensitive cross-section, essentially kind of mirroring the street section that's there today. If you're subdividing a residential lot on a residential street, particularly in the middle of a residential block, it's very unusual for the city to go in and widen those properties in front of those now 2 lots where there were 1. However, the code does require that, so this would provide some built-in exemptions if a lot was subject to residential infill compatibility, to where they would not necessarily have to provide those additional dedications. Again, the methodology looks at the 3 closest residentially zoned lots in both directions along the same side of the primary street as the subject lot, and all residentially zoned lots that are located directly across the primary street from this lot range selection in part or in whole. If one encounters a non-residentially zoned lot or a non-local street as defined in the code in any one direction, the sampling of lots in that direction shall terminate. Further, the comparative lot sample should not include any lots located across a non-local street. If a minimum comparative sample totaling at least 3 lots cannot be established, then these residential infill compatibility, subdivision, and recombination rules shall not apply, and it would just revert to the base R4 or R6 lot widths and lot minimums. Here's a sample on a residentially zoned street, looking 3 lots in each direction and then all the lots across the street. You would do a ranked listing of lot size, lot width, and lot depth, and derive a median from that sample size. And if the lot was proposed to be subdivided that resulted in any lot that dropped below 66% of that median lot size or lot width or lot depth, then that subdivision would not be approvable under this proposed text change. Here's another sample. At the bottom of the screen, this is Lynn Road. So in that case, the sample does not jump Lynn Road because of the magnitude or the designation of Lynn Road. So you would just be looking at Jean Drive, 3 lots to the north, 1 lot to the south, and those across. And this last example is along a major access corridor, New Bern Avenue, and the text change informs us to not look across the street and only look along that one side of New Bern Avenue. There are some exemptions if the lots involved in the subdivision or recombination are part of a neighborhood conservation overlay district where minimum lot size, minimum lot width, or minimum lot depth are regulated. These rules would not apply. Also, they would not apply in a general historic overlay district or a street side historic overlay district or are a part of a property designated a historic landmark. Also exempts subdivisions or recombinations, typically recombinations that are resulting in fewer lots than there are today, where all of the lots are equal to or larger in size, width, and depth than they were prior to the recombination, or otherwise conforming to the requirements of Section 227 G1A, which is part of the residential infill compatibility. Also exempts properties that are considered walking distance are 1,320 feet of an operating transit stop with service from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. where service intervals are no longer than 15 minutes during peak commute hours. And that's consistent with the language that the code already gives additional parking exemptions to with proximity to transit. This was a conversation at the text change committee. I know there was a comment possibly to increase that 15 minutes to 30 minutes, whereas most of our transit corridors today are typically only served with 30-minute intervals during peak commute hours. There are only a few that have the 15-minute service interval, so that was a conversation. No direction was provided, no decision was made, but that was one of the particular conversations at the text change committee when the group met last week. Another exemption is that all portions of the property involved in the subdivision or recombination are zoned R10. A residential 10 zoning district by its very nature is fairly different than the other residential zoning districts in that it allows multifamily structures, apartments, townhomes, which are typically not seen in the R4 and R6 zoning districts. And it also exempts lots fronting on the bulb of a cul-de-sac from the median lot width requirements set forth herein because typically lots on cul-de-sacs have a much narrower street frontage than other properties along the street. This also makes clear that our current residential infill rules as it relates to things like sidewall height, street setback, building articulation are not governing properties that are subject to review of Historic Development Commission for a certificate of appropriateness. Staff is operating under that procedure. However, it's just making it clear and certain in the code that there is no intent to apply those existing residential infill compatibility rules in the historic overlay districts. Some potential adverse impacts. It would prevent some property owners from realizing the potential economic benefits of subdividing their properties if they were proposing a subdivision where the lots dropped below 66% of the median lot size, lot width, or lot depth for those surrounding properties. Staff would not be able to approve the subdivision. Also limits the creation of new lots in older neighborhoods. It creates additional regulatory compliance hurdles for persons looking to recombine or subdivide their properties. And lastly, it does create additional complexities for staff review and increases staff review times. That concludes my overview, unless you have any questions of me at this time.
Any questions?
When a structure sits on two lots as it currently is, and that structure's removed, but it was, we see this a lot in some of the older neighborhoods, that would not preclude the ability to go through and build on both lots.
That's correct. Ghost lots are lots of record. So we've had, there was some concern during the review of this at Growth and Natural Resources about creating lots that were larger than the comparative median sample. So it was sort of a Goldilocks test. We don't want lots that are too big based on the context. We don't want lots that are too small. And we had to have conversations about neighborhoods where there are indeed ghost lots that are legal lots of record, and for comparative purposes, we would have to evaluate those in the comparison, even though they may all have been built across and essentially function as one lot. Cameron Village, north of the shopping center, for instance, typically everyone has two lots. And so those are technically, lots of record. So if we were to prevent the recombination of those, that could be counter to what the intent of we were seeking, is to reflect the development pattern more as it exists in reality than on paper in terms of those ghost lots. But this does not preclude the recognition of ghost lots. So that's a legal lot of record. Someone could build on it.
I think I have a follow-up question to that. Would it also be possible if you were to recombine and make a lot that was a little bigger and then come back later, and if it met the 66%, subdivide that? So, well, I can't think of a specific example, but if maybe you had a smallish lot and a really large lot, and by combining the two lots at a later time, come back through and create 3 lots.
At the time of subdivision, the lots on the ground would be the ones evaluated as part of the sample. So if that changed over time through further subdivision and or recombination, we would just look at the comparative sample that's applicable to that lot at the time the subdivision or recombination is being proposed.
So the idea is that it would the existing context would protect having 3 smaller lots than its surrounding neighbors potentially. I'm just wondering if you could recombine 2 lots now under this and create a larger lot, and then come back a couple years later, maybe it's a new owner, and then subdivide it the 66% of the average.
It would be based on the surrounding lots. So you would go 3 lots. So if you combine 2 lots into one, let me go back into these scenarios. So for instance here, if you combine that lot and this lot and created a larger lot, you would still be looking 3 lots in either direction. So now you would include this lot as well as this lot in the sample range. And so you'd have to perform that analysis to figure out what the median was for the surrounding properties, even though you may have created one larger lot here to begin with.
Okay, thank you.
Curious, how long does it take y'all to perform that analysis?
So the surveyor, typically, who's proposing the subdivision, would provide that information along with their plan to the city. If not, that would be a comment by the reviewer that this subdivision is subject to infill, and that analysis, or that information would need to be provided by the applicant. How long it takes them to get that information, I can't say, but we would run the math on the surrounding properties to calculate. In this case, there are 12 properties, so you would do a median lot size, just a ranked list of 12 numbers, and figure out which 2 are in the middle and average those together. Same thing with lot width and lot depth. So it's just doing 3 averages and then comparing the lot size dimensions of those proposed lots to see whether or not they drop below that 66%.
So I have a follow-up question to that. So how long does it take to do an NCOD that might try to address this?
Typically, those are about a 9-month process from start to finish.
And how much staff time is involved in that?
It varies depending on the NCOD. The North Hills involved around 400 properties. Staff has to do an analysis of 75th percentile for whatever the neighborhood wants to consider for evaluation. So in that case, we looked at building height, so we had to go out and measure building heights of approximately 400 homes. Same thing with minimum lot widths, minimum lot sizes. Setbacks are oftentimes included.
So do you do that even if they're only interested in the lot width? Do you do
We
the
only
other-
do what people are interested in studying.
Okay.
So North Hills originally was interested in all of those things. At the end of the day, when they came forward with their text change for the NCOD, it was only to address lot size minimums and lot width minimums, because they really kind of concluded that was their major concern, was further subdivision of properties, not necessarily the home sizes that were being built on them. The existing height out there is fairly small, mostly 1-story and split level, so the average height was fairly low. And the neighborhood decided that 2-story homes, in and of themselves, were not objectionable. However, the 75th percentile height numbers would have been challenging to allow for the construction of a 2-story home, so they did abandon that. Not exactly sure why they backed off on the setbacks, but I think it was the fact they felt that the infill regulations already addressed that. So they didn't feel the need to further code for that with their NCOD.
Thank you.
I had a question. I had asked that text change about just the kind of like hard numbers of how many R4 and R6 parcels there are in the city and how many acres that makes up, or any sort of numbers around that. Do we have that at all?
I don't have those numbers. R4, I believe, is our most predominant residential zoning district in terms of acreage, I believe. But what percent that is, I could not say.
Ms. Hicks, did you have a question?
I think so. Under dedications and public improvements, is that giving guidance for infill subdivisions, not necessarily infill lots?
Correct, because just a building permit typically for a single-family home is not considered a site plan, so there are no exactions or dedications to the public required when you pull a permit to build a home. But when you subdivide a lot, even one lot into two, it's treated the same as a 50-lot subdivision in terms of its requirements for public improvements along any street that lot abuts. So they would be subject to the street designations and associated streetscapes from the UDO, which are fairly consistent across the board, whereas older neighborhoods have a lot of variation in street widths and street cross sections from neighborhood to neighborhood over time. And so the dedications that are standard in the code today are not really reflective of the streetscape that exists in a neighborhood. I would note that the exemptions that are folded in at a minimum would allow for the installation of a sidewalk and curb and gutter at a later date were it not already provided along the property's frontage, so that it doesn't completely give you a pass, but it does accommodate the right-of-way width should there be a petition of citizens process or some city-initiated process to retrofit an existing neighborhood with sidewalks. That is still accounted for within this text change, so they're not completely off the hook for any improvements if sidewalks are not already provided.
Okay, thank you.
Does anyone else have questions for staff? All right, so Catherine, I'm going to ask for some help here. So we've heard this in text change committee, and so we had public comment there, so we are not required to have public comment here.
I was looking at actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really up to you. I know that it was referred out without any recommendations, so I don't know if the full commission would like to hear comment.
Okay. So we would need
always
to
have
vote to do that at this point.
You could do that, yeah.
Yeah, all right. So does anyone want to hear more comment from the public?
I would.
Okay, so do you want to make a motion for how much time you want to hear from each side?
Oh, that depends on how.
A max of 10 minutes, please.
Oh, yeah. Let's give everybody their due.
All right,
let's say
so
10 minutes.
10 minutes, 2 minutes per person. All right, so anybody who wants to come and speak in support of this has 2 minutes, and we'll take up to, we have 10 minutes total, so if people speak less than 2 minutes, we'll hold the time for them. Okay, all right.
Hi, my name is Helen Tart. I live at 611 Monroe Drive in Raleigh. I think that this is a good step in the right direction on dealing with some of the inappropriate development that has gone on all over the city, and so I'm really in favor of this change. Thank you.
Thank you. That was 30 seconds. Anybody else want to come forward and speak in support of this text change? Seeing no one, we'll move on to the opposition. Does anyone want to come forward and speak in opposition to this text change?
Good morning, Chair, members of the Planning Commission. My name is Suzanne Harris. I work for the Home Builders Association of Raleigh-Wake County. We do have concerns over the proposed regulation, namely because of the fact that I'm sure, as you have heard through the last 6 months or more, as elections have gone on and people have tried to find out what are the hot button issues for the citizens of Raleigh. Housing affordability, affordable housing, you've probably heard terms put both ways, has risen to the top above every other issue. And in the course of that discussion, people have asked themselves, what can we do? What can we do from the city of Raleigh's perspective? What we can do from the home builder side? What can we do from the citizen side to help address the issue across nonprofits, public sector, private sector, everybody? I would suggest to you that going down this road would just add additional costs and additional burdens as it pertains to that ability to achieve more housing affordability. And if you ask why, some of that goes down to the density. City of Raleigh is growing. The numbers used to be 64 or 5 a day. I believe it's dropped into the 50s, but it's still a large number of people moving here every day. And they do have to live somewhere. And I will just say for the record, since I do work for the Home Builders Association, there is a perception that because houses get built, people move here. We, just like any other business, respond to the demand. So people are moving here, so people are building houses to accommodate those individuals. And if you take away that ability to, this is probably a very small number when it comes down to it in terms of the ability to subdivide, but those existing lots have that ability under the current zoning, and by doing this, you'd be taking that ability away. I appreciate you guys considering it, and thank you for the time.
Thank you. All right, let's bring it back to the table. Well, before I go on, so is there another person who wishes to speak? Okay.
I'll be brief and just echo what Suzanne said. I do think, first of all, Isabel Maddox, P.O. Box 946, Raleigh, 27602. Not speaking on behalf of any client here, just for the city in general. First of all, I think infill, this will apply to the vast majority of the developed city. Infill is not just a little tight area inside the Beltline. It goes, far-reaching. Second, we have a densifying city. We need to find ways to provide more housing, more affordability. There is the option of an NCOD. I know that does take a while, but I think there's a reason that takes a while. It's because you need to get the buy-in from the whole neighborhood or a high majority of the neighborhood. And I think when you can't get that 75%, then maybe the neighbors don't really want it. I think this does give individuals a possible ability to subdivide, and I think it's an option that should be allowed that will result in more affordability, more density in Raleigh, which we need. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, before I try to bring it back to the table, is there anyone else here to speak in opposition to this? All right, seeing no one, I'll bring it back to the table for discussion and then a possible motion.
I'll start off. To the, rest of the commissioners who weren't at text change, I was pretty vocal at committee that this does not feel good to me. There's a number of things, like fact-based things, that I have issues with, but this starts to look at the two largest zoning districts in our city. We are somewhat capping, and that's why I was curious at how many parcels and how many acres this is impacting. When we went through the remapping before of mixed-use zones for the UDO, it was an extensive public process because it impacted so many people. I was trying to understand how many people's property this impacts by asking for the parcel numbers. I think it's a significant decision to do this. And I think that it's only one piece of a much broader conversation that we need to be having as a community. If we do this, it's, in my opinion, effectively pushing all new development outside of R4 and R6, putting pressure on all of the other parcels. And it also feels a little bit like some of the deed restrictions and other things that happened in our past relative to single-family housing that were exclusionary, and a lot were deemed illegal. This is obviously not illegal, but I think even some of the holdover deed restrictions in some of these neighborhoods that we're talking about were put there in place for very malicious reasons. So I just caution the conversation that we're having here and how we're having it. I'm going to keep saying this stuff, but that's why I'm asking for actual numbers, percentages of the community. This is a lot more than just subdivisions. And I also asked at Text Change Committee, how many in all of our 4 and our 6, we can do this through GIS. How many actual parcels are we talking about that can be subdivided with current zoning? There are parcels that can be recombined and then subdivided, but that's a lot more, then you're talking about multiple parties, et cetera. We haven't seen that, at least to my knowledge, for any of these NCOD cases. It's been corner lots and lots that have just been split in half. And so I also asked that question because I feel like we have to be managing fairly and by the numbers and not just based off feeling because we see one project. I do ask that there's 4 or 5 in each of these NCODs. I wonder, is that it? Like, was that it? Did the NCOD actually stop anything, or did it already happen? And so I guess I just am looking for a lot more information because right now this is so far from being palatable through my perspective and my lens, particularly with a background in urban planning and with us charged as looking out for the greater good of our community and not just, a few individuals. I think we have to remember that half or less than half of our community owns homes. So we just have to remember that. Thanks.
As a follow-up, I have a question. Was there any discussion, if it was possible to somehow allow slightly smaller lot sizes, but still maintain neighborhood character, which I think this is driving at maintaining that character, and not like putting a McMansion next to, a smaller home or something like that. Was there any discussion if that could be maintained through scale massing, roof articulation, materials relationship to the street, and sidewalk and relationship to the parking to structures in the street, which are all components of the built environment that really define the character of a neighborhood? Was there any discussion along that in text change?
Mr. Hodge? Was there any discussion in previous meetings to the Text Change Committee about that?
So GNR did discuss other percent thresholds. In fact, they were leaning toward larger numbers, so more like 75%. And we did various scenarios looking at those neighborhoods that had triggered NCODs based on concerns about subdivision or recombinations. And through that review, council felt that the 66% threshold was adequate to achieve the goal that they were after. 75%, or some other number higher than 66 clearly would have done similarly, but they felt comfortable that 66%, roughly a lot that's 2/3 the size of its neighboring lots, they felt was still in context with a neighborhood. It didn't go too far. But again, that's a subjective test that typically a lot that's going to be smaller than 66% is going to be closer to 50%. than, 50% of the size of the surrounding properties. And they felt that that was what was happening in these neighborhoods. The resulting lots were typically half of what the neighboring lots were, and that was what was driving this demand in those neighborhoods, at least, for the creation of a neighborhood conservation overlay district. NCODs can currently regulate additional things. Residential infill compatibility addresses street setback, sidewall height, and some building articulation if it's deeper than, if a sidewall or a building wall is more than 50 feet in length. But outside of that, currently, residential infill compatibility rules don't really address a lot of other built form types of things. It could, but that was not part of the conversation.
Any other questions or comments right now?
Well, I'm going to ask, probably is a stupid question, but these recombined lots would meet the minimum lot standard for R4 and R6 at 50%, is that right?
Well, it would vary. So today, absent the adoption of this regulation, yes, a subdivided lot would need to meet the district standard. The situation in these neighborhoods that went through the NCOD process is that they were developed at a lower density than how they were zoned. And so over time, there was kind of an expectation that this was sort of the character of their neighborhood, even though the zoning would have permitted further subdivision. As Mr. Tomasulo noted, oftentimes it takes a compilation of multiple lots. You might get 4 lots out of 3, but not necessarily 6 lots out of 3. So it's going to vary about how many lots you need to acquire to potentially increase the yield through further subdivision or recombination. But North Hills, for example, I believe based on existing lots, so that NCOD I think had about a dozen lots that were subdividable under their current context without acquiring multiple lots. And so when you start adding lots together, 2 lots potentially could be subdivided into 3. That analysis I don't think was performed because there's a lot of variability there. But for that 400 give or take lot NCOD in North Hills, I think there were only around a dozen that by themselves were further subdividable. But that NCOD did have some triggers related to recombination where they acquired multiple lots and then were able to further subdivide those 3 lots into 4 or 2 lots into 3, those types of situations. But in all cases, they would need to meet the minimum district standards. Again, these are for neighborhoods that were developed at a different density than how they're zoned.
So do you know, possibly out of the 12 lots that were dividable, how many would be prevented from being divided by this 66% standard?
I do not know. I would note that the ones that were subdivided that triggered these things, they were looked at when this was a GNR, and I believe all of those would have been prevented under the 66% threshold, and that's what GNR was looking at. Of the subdivisions that caused neighborhood concern, how many of those would have been allowed under these rules? And I think the number was close to 0, but there may have been 1 or 2 that might have been allowed even under that threshold. But it was very small.
Can you mention again how long this has been in circulation?
October 3rd, I think it was, of 2017. So a little over 2 years. So the previous council actually authorized this text change. But most of the work and review on it has occurred under this current council.
Any other thoughts? Okay, I'd like to just throw mine in. I know it's not a popular position to take these days, given the election outcome and some of the discussion that's been going on, but we did have quite a few people write in support of this text change. And I do believe that it is an important part of the infill mechanisms that we are trying to help neighborhoods use to maintain some aspect of what their neighborhoods are like. So I understand the real estate and development community's interest in seeing this text change not make its way forward because, you know, they profit from these subdivisions. However, there are quite a few people who are coming to this city who are looking for housing that's under $500,000. And there's less of that available these days. And these subdivisions usually end up in homes that cost well more than $500,000. And so for that reason and for reducing the amount of time that staff has to put into NCODs and neighborhoods need to put into NCODs, I think it's a reasonable thing to do at this time. We have a new council coming in. They can do analysis on the infill code at their leisure when they come in, and it can all be changed again. But for now, as we are trying to get through a reduction in staff commitment to NCODs, a reduction in stress on neighborhoods trying to get through this process, I think it's reasonable to take on this text change at this time. So I will vote in support of it or against anybody who, or any motion made to recommend against it. So I support the text change.
I'm finding I don't feel I can vote for this at this time based on Mr. Tomasulo's statements and my concern that limiting subdivision of R4 and R2 neighborhoods, which seem, looking at the future land use map and the existing map, seem to be dominant, the largest area in our city. I'm concerned that if these areas don't accept some density, that all of the density we're adding is going to be added to the balance of neighborhoods that are outside of those zones, and I don't believe that would be equitable.
I'm very conflicted on this because I see it from both sides very well. I will say that the density side of it does resonate with me. I mean, we got to find some place for people to live. The affordability, not so much, because I think that anybody would be hard-pressed to show me that the infill subdivide model results in any affordable housing. I just don't see it, but I do see the density side of it. I have the 66% is what really, I think effectively we are. I just don't think that you can even subdivide anything with that type of ratio. I think it's going to be very difficult to do. I know that that's part of the intent. Sometimes, you know, it's kind of one of those things. Sometimes I see it and it looks to be in context, and other times it doesn't. That I just have a real hard time going through and making it so difficult to subdivide these lots. You know, and I know that that's, from the point of view of staff, I have a feeling this is going to take up a lot more time with staff than is the NCOD project. You know, so again, that argument really doesn't resonate with me, just knowing what's going to go into this every time. So at this point, I reluctantly, I mean, I'm not going to support it at this point, just because I think that it's not, it's too heavy-handed for what we're trying to do. You know, I do see it from a neighborhood and character, and I could ride you around and show you really good bad examples, and I could show you some really good examples. I mean, you know, so it is one of those things that's very difficult, and demand is still out there. I don't see any of these infill subdivided lots that aren't sold. I mean, you know, so there is demand from the people coming here and people that are already in Raleigh looking for this. So again, I live in a neighborhood that's had a lot of infill, a lot. probably as much as anybody in Raleigh, and so I do see it from both sides, and at this point, I can't, as currently is brought forward, I just can't support it. But I do have a lot of empathy for what it's trying to accomplish. I don't think we're there with how it's currently written.
Any other thoughts, or are we ready for a motion? Okay.
To also, with Commissioner Tomasulo, I'm also concerned about not really knowing the numbers, and it seems to be in a I don't want to say a vacuum, but we don't really know the impact, the true impact of what this decision will be for the city of Raleigh, and being stewards of helping plan Raleigh, to have a better idea of what we're dealing with. So that is my request, to know what those numbers are, the impact numbers.
I do have some numbers on percent of the city that is zoned R4 and R6. I can't specifically say what percent thereof are on streets that are older than 20 years and meet the infill test, because it's a lot by lot analysis. But I can say that approximately 35% of the entire city is zoned R4 and 15% is R6. Specifically, what percent of those numbers, again, meet the infill test, I wouldn't know. And again, specifically, how many of those lots are subdividable or are not subdividable under this test, again, I would not have those numbers.
I'm sorry, what was the R4?
Approximately 35% of the entire city and 15% of the city is R6.
Okay, thank
So
you.
by what, the numbers or the percentages that were just shared, so we're looking at literally half the city.
Well, how much of the city is built prior to R4 and R6 and the current R4 and R6 standards? These are, I think we're talking about older neighborhoods with larger lot sizes, and then R4 and R6 is applied afterward?
No, I think that the land developers at the time, people put greater values on large yards, and land was relatively inexpensive. So they, even if the zoning was R4, they subdivided it at less than that yield. And sometimes the lots, as we know, are twice or more large. I think what Eric was trying to get at is that there's no algorithmic way to answer the question as to how many lots would be subjected to this. We could sample certain neighborhoods, but there's a lot of manual heavy lifting, because you got to look at lots that are not only currently twice the size or twice the size that the density would allow, which they have to be in order to subdivide them, but what are their dimensional, could they meet the dimensional requirements for lot width, et cetera, if they were subdivided, which is a test I don't think we could program the GIS to do. We would have to look at it ourselves, and then are they located in an area where this would even apply? And that's not even getting into the question of recombination and subdivision of more than one lot at a time, which I think would just be an extremely hard thing, fraught with a lot of assumptions. So I think a rough number could be put together. A precise census type number would be a very daunting challenge that would consume a tremendous amount of staff time. And I'm not sure that going to that level of accuracy would change the decision. But we could probably get, a sampling of different areas that do qualify, and looking at what their general notion is like. In terms of the age of neighborhoods, I think you find this much more in places that were platted in the 60s, 70s, and to some extent the early 80s. After that, people were much more likely to develop land at its permitted density.
So I'm just going to speak up just based on my background in real estate and affordable housing. I do think that the greater density issue, I think I have concerns about not being able to respond to the growth of a city. I agree that we would be hard pressed to show that the new lots or the new housing would be cheaper, and that it does create affordability. But the thing is that we're making a decision today based on lots that were built in the 60s or set in the 60s, and this was an issue that was brought up 2 years ago, which is a very different discussion that is today. And I completely understand what's going on in the city with some of the areas in the McMansions. It looks odd driving through these neighborhoods. But this particular text change, I believe, is so limiting to the fact that, it limits the city to properly plan and manage growth or manage accepting new people into the community, and then where do those homes go? I think all of that is of great concern, and as we look at where people go, I mean, the housing affordability, we can manage it better if we don't kind of restrict ourselves in a severe way.
Following up Ken's comment, I am curious. Like, I feel like at this point, the high level, not necessarily, I feel like there's a few queries that I feel like could be done in GIS to get a rough number, as you said, and I would be really interested in reviewing that before voting on this.
Okay.
Meaning holding it at the table and waiting till next time. Is that, I mean,
I think we could, again, put together some rough queries, things like highlighting lots that are twice the permitted density.
Yeah.
Because remember,
Super
density,
basic.
as opposed to minimum lot size under the UDO today, controls lot splits. So if you're an R6, your lot split has to meet the 6 units per acre, which leads to a larger minimum lot size than the minimum lot size in the R6 district. You can only get to the minimum lot size in the R6 district in the context of a larger subdivision where some of the land is consumed by streets and other common areas. That's why the lot sizes are smaller than what the permitted density was, because if they were the same as as dividing the number 6 into the number of square feet in an acre, you would not be able to get R6 density for any subdivision that included streets and common areas.
is it, so with low effort, could that a very simple metric?
We could look at, yeah, we could do that for the R4 and R6 districts, which are the main focus area here, and probably produce some maps and some rough numbers. But again, to test whether the lots are in a place where infill would apply, and to test whether the lots would actually meet the dimensional requirements of the ordinance. I mean, they probably would if they're twice.
Yeah.
If they're twice the permitted density, but there always are some unique circumstances.
It at least starts giving us some numbers, I think, for scale.
So I'd be interested in that too. Maybe I'm wildly off on this, but Suzanne is right that this is probably a very small number of lots that would be affected by this standard. Have to be a fairly large lot in the first place. How many are there? I don't know. I also think there's a larger question that we keep bumping up against in rezoning cases and in this kind of case of whether every neighborhood in the city, regardless where it is, should be a candidate for density of some kind, and if so, what kind? We have rural residential districts. They are deemed to be rural. People in Raleigh, I think, like having part of the community be rural, as well as part of the community be urban and then suburban. A mix of neighborhoods, I think, helps a city succeed. So, my bias, I guess, is to protect the character of neighborhoods that exist where there isn't transit available, where density is not desirable, because there are lots of places in Raleigh where density is desirable and where density is coming. So that's my 2 cents. But I would be interested in some analysis of how big an impact this text change would have.
So in the interest of time, because we have a very long agenda, I'd like for us to come to a plan for this and move on. So it sounds to me like we have at least 2 or 3 people who are willing to hold this at the table before we take a vote. Okay, so I see a lot of nodding heads. It sounds like we have a lot of people who are willing to hold this for 2 weeks. Is that reasonable? To continue the discussion with some additional information? Is that something staff could do?
Yeah, two would be reasonable.
The
Yeah,
12th,
the next meeting is fine.
12th of November? Is
Yeah.
that- Okay. All right, so we're going to table this until the 12th of November and move on to the next agenda item.
Right, that actually gets us 3 weeks, so. It's a third
yeah,
Tuesday, or a
so-
fifth Tuesday month in
So
October.
you get an extra week.
Right.
Okay. All right, so we're tabling it to the 12th of November meeting, and we were looking forward to some more information from staff. Thank you. So moving on to old business. And the majority of cases, in fact, I think all of the cases in old business fall under the procedure that we've heard these before. We've had opponents and proponents come up and speak about these cases. So unless we vote to hear more from the public, we will deliberate without that. So we'll move on to Blue Run Lane, CP 619, and can we get staff to come forward?
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the Planning Commission. This is a request to amend the future land use map. And it would change the designation on the future land use map from rural residential to moderate density residential. This proposal consists of 2 parcels. We have as yet to receive a vote on this case from the Northeast CAC. Also, City Council did grant a 90-day extension, putting the new deadline for this case to December the 20th. Again, the map, I would note that the original proposal contained 3 parcels. However, this was revised based on landowner objection, is now 2 parcels totaling about 60 acres. The existing zoning, note that the northernmost tract is zoned AP, which is agriculture production. The southern tract is zoned R4. Parkway Corridor is the urban form map designation. Just an aerial view showing its location near the Buffalo Road interchange with I-540, and it does front the western boundary of the proposed site, does border the Neuse River, and is across from the Buffalo Road Athletic Park, more close in view. Staff found that this proposal was inconsistent overall with the 2030 comprehensive plan, and note the inconsistent policies listed here. The area would require an annexation should a future development desire to connect to city services, and it would have to be annexed before any zoning was applied. Also, there would be a greenway easement required to connect to the Neuse River Trail. And again, the deadline is December 20th. I believe the applicant is here today to answer any questions.
Mr. Bell?
Yes.
Could you remind me which, when the vote date is for the CAC meeting?
Thursday, November the 14th.
Thursday, November the 14th. So what's your pleasure? Should we hold the case over until we get a CAC vote? Assuming the applicant would agree to that?
Yes, this is Michael Birch with Longleaf Law Partners. Yes, we're asking for a deferral to the meeting on the 26th, which will allow for the vote and also hopefully the zoning case to catch up as well.
Okay.
Michael, is the zoning case the entire 60 acres or just part of it?
No, it's just that southern parcel now under the, here. Okay. It's kind of that one there. Just that southern one.
And one more question, since this is not annexed and it's not part of the city, this is similar to our case we just saw where people who were most affected couldn't vote at the CAC. Is this possibly another situation where we'll have people at CAC who can't actively vote as citizens of Raleigh?
I believe that is the case if they are not within the corporate limits or the ETJ, yes.
Okay, so we'll have to keep that in mind when it comes back after the CAC vote. All right, so with
Quick question.
Sure.
If I may. Can you go back to the inconsistent stuff real quick? Is there, I mean, given the site and everything else, is there a way to move any of those off the inconsistent policy side?
Potentially, with regard to the EP policies, there could, of course, be some conditions to address our concerns there. However, the land use and transportation-related policies are more problematic.
So let's just be clear, though. This is a comprehensive plan amendment, and you can't really attach conditions to a comprehensive plan amendment unless they're adopted as policy language somewhere in the plan. And therefore, this is simply a change on the map that doesn't change any existing entitlement, but would set the stage for a future zoning request to be consistent with the density that they're requesting on the future land use map. So, and of course, at the time that such zoning case were to be brought, if it were to be brought, then obviously these policies would also be applied to that, at which point there would be an opportunity to add regulatory conditions.
I'm saying because it's a comp plan, not a rezoning, if you were to approve it with inconsistent overall, it wouldn't amend the inconsistent comprehensive plan policies. It would not.
It would not. Okay.
And just to clarify, the rezoning case associated with this proposal is Z31, and that is presently in staff review. And that, so a date that would come to the Planning Commission is not definite. It's likely to be one of the November meetings, however.
All right, with that, then we will table this until the 26th of November. Thank you.
Thank you.
Moving on to CP 719 Sumner Boulevard.
Good morning. The next case is CP-7-19 Sumner Boulevard. Let's see if I can find this. Concerns an currently unbuilt and undedicated segment of Sumner Boulevard extending west from Capitol Boulevard towards Old Wake Forest Road. And the proposal is to both change the designation of that proposed street as well as to change the alignment. So it would be reducing the designation from a 4-lane avenue to a 2-lane avenue. And then not seeing it. There we go. Sorry about that. And so when this first came in, it was proposed to have this alignment. The applicant has subsequently consulted with the neighboring property owner, and they have reached what I'm to understand is an agreement that this alignment is preferable to both the applicant and the neighboring property owner. The other change in this case is that it has been to the North CAC for a vote, which was 12 in favor and 4 against. And the main concern that I heard at the meeting was that this area, or this portion of roadway, would be part of a larger loop that would pass all the way around the interchange of 540 and Capitol Boulevard. So it would run east from here over to Triangletown Boulevard, and then run along the east side of Triangletown Center Mall. There is an existing interchange that would allow it to pass under 540 and then continue north and to the west and meet up with Gresham's Lake Road in the northwest quadrant of that interchange. And so some portions of that loop are designated as a 4-lane, some portions are designated as a 2-lane, and some portions are already constructed as a 4-lane. And so the concern raised at the CAC was, does this impact that overall loop having 2-lane portions and 4-lane portions? Transportation planning has said that that is not seen as an issue because the forecasted number of trips, the traffic volume in this area, the size that's proposed in this comprehensive plan amendment is appropriate to the number of trips. So I'd be happy to take any questions.
Any questions for staff? All right, because we've heard from the applicant and the public about this, we can either choose to open it up for more, or we can just choose to process this case now. So does anyone have a preference?
My preference would be to approve it.
Okay, so, all right, so shall I take a motion then?
Yeah, I'll move approval of CP 719 as being consistent with the comprehensive plan and in the public interest.
Do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor, say, oh, wait, I forgot to ask for discussion. Any further discussion? All right, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, unanimous. Thank you. Moving on to Z2119 South New Hope Road.
We have a few slides this morning. Okay, thank you. So this is a request that you saw a few weeks ago and deferred to allow for some changes to the conditions. So I won't go in a great deal about the overview, but we'll talk about the changed conditions. So this is part of the Old Town PD that has been rezoned or is being rezoned in chunks, and this is the portion that is at the center of that old existing PD, about 60 acres on the east side of New Hope, South New Hope Road. And the request, it's currently partially PD, partially R10. Request is to rezone it to CX5 with some conditions. I'll talk about those conditions. Again, this is a look at that overview of the prior PD. So there are actually two of these pieces that are before you today. The one that we're looking at now is here, and then one on the west side of South New Hope. It's a better look at the different pieces in play. And then the site itself, it is currently undeveloped, as are the adjacent properties. And so there were 5 conditions in front of you last time, prohibiting uses, primarily office and medical, probably the most relevant ones to this request. Limiting residential development to 450 units of no more than 2 bedrooms each. Limiting commercial uses to 360,000 square feet. Specifying on one of the properties that there's no more than 300,000 square feet of non-residential use, and if there's more than 100,000, then a grocery store would have to be included. And then no more than 9 standalone restaurants along the section that fronts on New Hope Road. So there was discussion at the last Planning Commission meeting about some additional conditions which have been provided, and I'll provide a quick summary of those. So one is that portions of buildings within 150 feet of any structure on adjacent properties limited to 4 stories. So I would note the practical effect of that is somewhat uncertain. It would depend on the timing of development on the site versus the adjoining sites. Right now there are no structures on either. So again, it refers to structures and not parcels. So it essentially says whichever goes first establishes the context. So if the residential parcels adjacent to this developed first, then clearly this would take effect, and it would say that anything within 150 feet of those structures would have to be no more than 4 stories, which corresponds to comprehensive plan guidance about height and height transitions near lower scale residential areas. On the other hand, if this property were to develop first, then there would be no structures on the adjacent properties, no context, and the implication then is that the adjacent properties would respond to this context. A few other conditions: one, slightly larger shade trees at the time of planting, 3.5 inches would be required. Number 3, actually similar to number 1 in that it looks at conditions that are currently not established. So no standalone bars within 100 feet of any adjacent residential structures. And then lastly, there's an existing tunnel near the entrance, and the thought process, I understand from the applicant, is to use that as part of the pedestrian circulation on the site. There was some discussion about that, whether that could definitely feasibly be used. So this condition says if it can't, for whatever reason, then there would be an equivalent 10-foot wide pedestrian path connecting to the sidewalk network. So just a little bit of reference again, now that we went through those conditions. So those talking about height and uses apply to those, anything within 150 feet or 100 feet of those adjacent areas. The 9 standalone restaurant condition applies on this parcel, and then the maximum 300,000 square feet, and then the requirement potentially for a grocery store on that parcel. So in terms of consistency with the comprehensive plan, was deemed to be consistent previously. The conditions didn't change. Any of the policies deemed to be consistent or inconsistent. Several consistent policies, few inconsistent policies relating primarily to the transition of commercial uses or higher scale to lower scale and residential uses. So clearly the conditions go to that point, but not enough to necessarily change the policy findings there. Just to recap, this does have a CAC vote. There were actually 2 votes that related to both this request and the one that you'll hear a little bit later on across the street. So on a simple up and down, they received a positive vote. There was a second vote that had a few conditions. One, that a grocery store be included. So there's a condition that does, to an extent, go to that. If there's a certain amount of retail, it would trigger the requirement for a grocery store. If more is to be provided, that there be a maximum of 300,000 square feet of office, there would be less than that. Landscaping of a higher quality, clearly that's fairly subjective. There is the condition about the larger trees at the time of planting, and then that there be some guarantee of a mix of uses with sit-down restaurant, bank, and gas station. So no outstanding issues. Happy to take any questions that you have.
So I'm going to check before I get started into this. So we had quite a bit of discussion about this case last time. Conditions have come forward. We've heard from the applicant. We've heard from the public. Do we need to have more discussion about this, or are we ready for a motion?
I have a concern.
Okay.
It seems like the CAC request hasn't really been fully considered. And the one item I'm pulling out of the staff report is the fact that there's no pedestrian and bicycle access being provided to the greenway or the proposed park. That there's apparently a park proposed in the zoning conditions for an adjacent property, and this is near to the Walnut Creek Greenway Trail, and it seems like the density of the apartments here would merit pedestrian-friendly access to those amenities.
I think I would let the applicant speak to that.
So can we bring the applicant forward to speak to that?
Yeah, in a similar vein, the pedestrian connection from this side of South New Hope Road to the other side, it could be defined in an agreement between the respective applicants. Hasn't been so far, I think. Isn't that right?
Correct. Charles Walker, 275 North Pea Ridge Road, Pittsburgh, North Carolina. Thank you for your time. We have given extra conditions that we hoped would answer some of your questions. Specifically to your question, this particular case is not near or not next to the Walnut Creek Greenway. That's the rest of the project that is being developed by the Halley Group. We have been working very well together in all facets of this design about trying to coordinate issues. There are a lot of greenways that run through, I think, that are going to be run through the surrounding property of us. We do have on one of our revised conditions that we will provide a greenway, but the issue that we're trying to deal with is we are surrounded by a single project that has not yet been developed. So all we can do is react to what we know is in the queue now. We also would rely on the city code in the UDO that requires sidewalks, pathways, and everything that we go around us to do. So we're going to rely on part of the city conditions to do that, the city code. We're interested in trying to make that condition or that connection strong. We agree that a commercial use with apartments, and then if you look at Z22, which also has an office component, it is important that pedestrians have a connection. Our issue is the fact that all the land around us is in flux. We have a monthly meeting with Eric's group to update each other about where we're going in the process. The original land plan for this section of the commercial property of Old Town, the southern boundary was a right-of-way, was a road right-of-way. That's one of the reasons why it's so straight. And I ask Eric every week, is that going to be a right-of-way? If it is, then we can start putting sidewalks and driveways and everything, and they haven't made that decision yet. So that's why I haven't been able to say that the greenway is going to be 200 feet from the intersection of the main entrance. We just haven't gotten that deep into the details yet. All I can do is promise that it will be there, either with conditions or with the requirements of the UDO and the city code.
Right, that sounds great. And so I guess that's in line with one of the mitigation impacts staff has identified is that the applicant could add a condition requiring an internal pedestrian network that will connect to the adjacent network.
We could add something to that effect, but from our view, that's pretty well stated in the UDO and the city code. If there's something that the commission wants us to do to make that stronger, we will sure be willing to do that.
Yeah, I guess I'm asking for you to add the condition that staff identified.
Okay.
So can we have staff speak to that condition as to whether it is redundant of UDO or whether it's
I did want to point out when Eric was here at the last meeting and we were talking about the pedestrian tunnel and the land use across the way, during the zoning case, that somewhere in that area right to the north of us was going to be a city park or a city park dedication. But I want to remind you that Eric at that meeting said it wasn't sure it was going to be there, or there. So that's what we're trying to chase where this is going. So if we say that we're going to do a strong pedestrian park connection directly to the north, well, there may not be a city park directly to the north. Those are the kind of issues we're dealing with.
But there is a greenway to the north, right? You can connect to the greenway.
We can't connect to the greenway directly because the greenway is 1,500 feet away from us across
a different property.
4 tracts of land.
Yeah.
Well, you can create a connection on your property that would go to the greenway.
And that's what and that's why we're going, and that's why we're saying what we're saying is we will go to our perimeter, and then the next step, the perimeter goes further into the project, and then goes to the greenway with the Halley Group. We don't have direct access to Walnut Creek. Walnut Creek is over 1,000 feet away from us.
Maybe I'm misunderstanding this. You were saying you would have you would either use that tunnel,
yes,
or apparently that's not likely, or you'll have a pedestrian path to New Hope Road, and then the connection to the greenway would be the sidewalk.
Actually, the pedestrian that we're promising as part of our conditions is a direct 10-foot wide greenway easement to the main sidewalk of the new main entrance that will bisect the project, and it will ultimately lead to the greenway. The road, we're bounded by the road. The road will be built with sidewalks on both sides. It's a large street cross section, and then the greenway requirement that the Halley Group has to have to get from point A to point B. We'll get from our property to point A, but to get it from point A to point B at the greenway is reliant on the Halley Group.
Okay, so, but again, if I'm understanding this correctly, we're going to get to that greenway
Yes.
in the Halley Group
Yes.
up the sidewalk on New Hope Road,
Yes, yes.
not in any more direct way.
Well, the Parks and Rec Department have been looking for properties on the north side of the creek because they need a place for a bridge that goes across there to land.
Yeah.
Because all the greenways can be planned on Old Town, they just got to get to the other side of the creek.
Yeah, so are you ready for them to land when they come over?
Well, if we own that land, we'd be first to say you could do it, but we're going to be relying on the sidewalks and the internal greenways to Old Town. We'll make it stronger however you feel fit, but the fact that we're 1,000 feet from the greenway and that we don't own the land.
Yeah, I guess I should probably clarify what I'm trying to say is that my understanding of the staff recommendation is that this would be general language that would agree with your promise you're making, your verbal promise, and my request is that you take that verbal promise and put it into writing as a condition.
Absolutely. Absolutely. As the staff guides us, as the staff will tell us to do, we will do that.
So the other question in my mind is getting across New Hope Road from your project to the commercial project on the other side. Is there some way you can assure that that'll be a safe pedestrian crossing?
There is a current traffic study being done by the Halley Group with the DOT. I know the Planning Commission doesn't get involved with private development issues, but the private contract that we have with the Halley Group is actually going to be the builder of all the improvements on New Hope Road. So we anticipate that the new entrance that is going to be built from Old Town is going to be signalized. So if there is anything that we need to provide to get whether it's a pedestrian plateau or anything to get it across there, we are more than willing to do, but we just don't have the answer from the DOT how that's being done. And it's a 4-lane, because it's going to be a 4-lane with a divided median, it'll have a safe landing in the median.
Does our code address that at all? Does our code assure a safe pedestrian?
Well, the cross-section of New Hope Road is four lanes with a median and sidewalks on both sides. So we just, yes.
So I get that, but so my task is to hustle across that road to the median and then?
Well, obviously, if the signalization is approved, obviously it will have pedestrian crossings and with signalization for the pedestrian crossing.
And if it isn't?
Then that's something that we'll have to provide.
Can you offer a condition that you will provide it if there is no DOT initiated signal?
If a pedestrian crossing signalization needs to be added for outside the DOT, we will provide that.
That'd be great. Thanks.
Do you mind if I
No,
clarify a couple things?
Please.
The applicant nor the city is really in a position to be able to assure that we can put any kind of signalization on New Hope Road because it's an NCDOT maintained street. So if there's a signal put there as a result of the traffic study and NCDOT approves that signal, our code would require, and our development, and even NCDOT standards would require there to be a signalized pedestrian crossing. If there was no vehicle signal for a full movement signal, it would be up to NCDOT to approve there to be a POC or an RFP or some other intervention there. So I think the only thing the applicant might be able to do is to commit to pay the cost of that regardless of whether it's needed from a traffic study or, and assuming NCDOT approves it, as a part of the development of that land. I don't think it's a very likely scenario that there won't be a traffic signal placed there, but we don't know that at this time. And of course, then another thing that's potential is the applicant could seek an encroachment to build a tunnel or a overpass or something. It would be extremely expensive between those two, and I don't know that it warrants that either. But that's really the universe of possibility, given that it's not our street to control.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. I don't think we need to ask you for a tunnel or a bridge. And it sounds like you're going to get a signal, but just in case you don't, would you commit to paying for the cost of a hawk?
Sure, yes.
And is that something that can be conditioned in? Okay. So
If we don't, just leaping ahead, since Z21's on one side and Z22's on the other, we would probably do a matching condition so that they could be shared across the road.
Split it with them.
That's what I'm saying, is we may, if we have a condition that's created as part of Z21, we would mirror it in Z22.
Right.
So it would be split between the two properties.
Okay, that'd be right.
all right, so it sounds to me like we have 2 requested conditions for this case, and typically we hold the case vote until we have the conditions. So
If there is any way that the Planning Commission can see itself clear with the conditions that they'll be in place before the council, before it gets to the council meeting, that would be helpful for us.
let staff speak to that, because it has been something that we haven't done on a regular basis. It's very rare, especially when we have the 90-day extension, I believe, until January. So
that's right. And
yeah,
just from a matter of procedure, conditions can't be added once the Planning Commission makes the recommendation. And it gets to the City Council table. So the City Council would have to hold the item at their next meeting, defer it for 2 weeks to allow the applicant to add additional conditions, and then a public hearing could be set after that point. So there's really no savings of time.
so you can wait 2 weeks with us or wait 2 weeks with them. So I think we should hold it here for the 2 additional conditions, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks.
Okay.
Am I the only
Free,
one here?
November 12th.
Am I the only one here who would like that 150-foot buffer zone? Plan calls for it to be max 4 stories, but you're saying it'll be 5 stories unless there's something built within 150 feet. And
Right, our buffer is, our suggested buffer is based on structure. And the reason why we're doing that, quite frankly, is that this zoning case and the zoning case across the street is trying to be built as the urban core of Old Town.
Yeah.
So what we're trying it seems counterproductive that we try and push stuff away that hasn't been built yet that's part of the same project, and so we can integrate it better together. That's why we're doing it. If the Halley Group creates a plan that has structures that would affect the setback, then obviously that would be the case. If they do not, and then we have our condition in place, then they know what they're building to. And as you've seen, they are familiar with that, and Mr. Rifkin was not able to be here today, and he gave his letter of recommendation in support of the zoning case. So he is aware of it. They are the only ones that can build it. And so that's why we're trying to create that urban core and not create something that has a green belt around it that is disconnected from the rest of the project.
not a green belt, just tapering down to 4 stories.
Well, we will taper down. If something is built that's within 150 feet, it will be tapered down to 4. It will be tapered to 4 stories. But in this case, the Halley Group doesn't even know what they're building yet.
First, then you won't taper it down to.
If we get there first, then it will not be tapered down on our project. But the Halley Group knows that we are doing this, so if they feel like that's an issue, they can push back because it's a 500-acre green space next to us, or greenfield development, I'm sorry.
Okay.
All right, so we're going to hold this case until the 12th of November to pick up the 2 additional
Are
conditions.
there any further conditions
Yes,
so we don't
please.
so
If
this
there's-
doesn't
yeah,
happen
so
again?
we're not
I
pushing-
thought we had it nailed the last time,
Yeah.
but if anyone has any other questions, please let me have it now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Welcome. Moving on to Z 2319, 13051, and 13055 Strickland Road.
Good morning. All right, Z 2319, 1351 and 13055 Strickland Road. It has come before you about a month ago originally, and it was held at the table to allow the applicant time to go to the CAC to get a vote. That has since taken place, and I'll just do a brief overview of the case again so everyone's familiar. It's a request to rezone just under 7 acres from R2 to R10 with conditions. As I mentioned, the case went to the CAC. They voted to recommend denial in a vote of 4 yes to 217 no. Excuse me. And the Planning Commission deadline for action is December 9th, 2019. I'll go through these a little faster since we've seen this before, but if folks have any questions, please let me know, and I'd be happy to elaborate on any of the points. As you know, the zoning of the site is R2, and it's generally R2 in the area surrounding it. To the east and then to the west, it changes to R4, and it's generally detached homes in both the R4 and the R2 areas surrounding the site. The site itself is 2 parcels that have somewhat of an odd shape. The parcel line is roughly in the middle of those 2, and it's located, it does not front a public road. There will be public road access that is being provided from an unrelated development. So the parcel to the north of the site, and this is just a rough outline, is being redeveloped under its current entitlement. And as per the UDO, they will be providing road access that will look roughly like this. And again, that's just an estimate. But that road access will be provided to the site regardless of the outcome of this rezoning case as part of a separate process. This is just another view of the site. It has some odd features on it, that it's shaped 2 parcels that are sort of oddly shaped, and then this is a power line easement that is going through the middle. And just for clarification's sake, buildings cannot be located under that power line easement. However, roads are permitted with some regulation from Duke Energy. And then this is showing some greater detail of the road connection that you can see to the north of the site that will be provided from that approved subdivision that exists. The purple is the power line easement, and the blue is the currently existing Hare Snipe Creek. Per the UDO, there is a required buffer on both sides of the creek. It's a 50-foot buffer from the center line of the creek that would exist on both sides of the bank, and that area cannot be built on. These are a few different views of the site. Again, since the site doesn't have road access, these are views from the road that is nearest to the site, just to give some general context around the area. So number 1 is looking from Woody Hill Drive, that is a neighborhood that's zoned R2, to the east of the site. And then view number 2 is looking to the site standing on Strickland Road. So the site would be somewhere behind the tree line, but that is as close as I was able to get given the lack of road frontage currently. Summary of the proposed conditions. These are similar to what you saw previously. The apartments are prohibited. Residential density is limited to 6 units per acre. Setbacks will be a minimum of 30 feet from the primary side streets and the rear lot line, and a reforested transition yard will be required adjacent to 2 properties along Woody Hill Road. And the full text of number 4, the reforested transition yard, refers to pins and the Book of Deeds, so it's a bit more specific than it shows here, but this is just for summary purposes. This map is showing the approved subdivision to the north of the site, and this again is just for illustrative purposes. This is the site directly to the north, and this is the road. So again, this is Strickland Road up here, and this is the road that would be providing access to the site that you can see down here that's located bordering this approved subdivision. To show the existing versus the proposed zoning, and I apologize, as I'm looking at this, I see that I did not make an update to this section. These should all say 30 because they added zoning conditions that would provide 30-foot setbacks in all of those areas. But to touch upon the rest, the current zoning is R2, proposed is R10 with zoning conditions, It would increase the density to just under 6 units per acre, and the estimated maximum units would be approximately 39, which would be an increase from the currently estimated 13 in the R2 zoning. This request is consistent with low-density residential future land use map designation that recommends a residential density of up to 6 units per acre. It also has a portion that's zoned for, the future land use map designation is public parks and open space, and this area is generally covering where the hair snipe creek exists, and that would mean that the area cannot be developed on, which generally leaves it consistent with the future land use map designation. There's no urban form guidance for the area. It's consistent with the comprehensive plan, again with the future land use map, and there's no urban form guidance. Consistent policies are, again, future land use map, compact development, as this would allow for greater density in an area with sufficient infrastructure to serve it. Reinforcing the urban pattern, that's referring to a similar increase in density in an area that has sufficient roads, fire, and other city services to serve the proposed increase, as well as zoning for housing that would allow for a greater variety of housing in the area. Inconsistent policies generally are related to neighborhood conservation as well as infill compatibility, in that the neighborhood would see a change in character should this be approved, given what's currently built around the site. There are no outstanding issues. The previous outstanding issue was the CAC vote. Now that that has taken place, no outstanding issues left, and the deadline for action is December 9th, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
Questions for staff?
The road, could you go back to the map showing the lot? So how would that road get to the western portion of that property?
I'm going to go back just one more to kind of look at this, my drawing, and I'd be happy to go back to the more schematic approach. But so the connection would come through this site to the top of the subject property and connect somewhere around here, and then any further connection on the site would be the responsibility of the subject property owner.
So is it possible to build a road through that narrow neck there?
I would like to allow the applicant to speak on that piece, since they have an engineering firm that looked at some of the specifics on there, and I think they could provide a little better detail than I on that piece, if that's all right.
Okay, then one reason I ask is that the entitlement here is, you say 39 units. I'm not sure it's quite that much if you have to conform with R10, but it's a significant number of units. I'm not sure, is it possible to just build all of the entitlement on the east side of the, below here, Snipe Creek there?
Right,
and
so you
leave
mean
the
just sort
western
of under there.
portion alone?
So that's a challenging part for staff, in that we can't complete a full site plan review. We have a tool called Envision Tomorrow that we use that roughly calculates what we think the density on the site can be, and we do remove things like the creek, we remove the power line easement, and we remove some estimates for a road width. So our best estimation puts us at 39 units. I could not tell you with absolute certainty that that is the exact estimate, but we tend to sway a little higher for these. The applicant might be able to speak a little bit more about what they think the yield for the site would be.
Well, I'm really asking about the limit of 6 units per acre. It is applying to both sides of that saddle bag. But could it all be put on one side and not the other?
I think that would change the density calculation, given the minimum lot size and width, that if you tried to place that many properties on this, that would be, there would be some physical constraints. But again, without seeing a proper site plan, it's difficult to speak on the exact numbers of what can fit.
I'm not saying you could put all 39 there or even 29. I'm saying you wouldn't build it all on the west. And so the 6, I'm talking about consistency with the low density residential designation. It's only 6 units per acre in theory. It might actually be quite a bit more than that.
Sure. So
if everything's built on the east side of this site.
So the way that we calculate density is consistent across all zoning cases. We take the gross site area, not the net site area. We do this because we don't have the tools, or we cannot require a site plan at the time of rezoning. Therefore, it would be an inexact calculation to try to take out different portions of the site that are not buildable on. So we're providing a rough estimate looking at the net site area of the land.
Right. Thank you.
So, go ahead.
Question. connecting that road that you've got there to the west side with the stream going across there and the buffers that are around the stream, I'm assuming, I guess.
Mhm.
And that can, I mean, if you consider, can that actually be done?
So the Department of Environmental Quality will have regulation over a road crossing over a stream, but I think that's another piece that the applicant could speak to in terms of how that could actually be carried forth, that I think they've done some research in that respect.
Okay, thank you.
I'm
And
interested
can
in
you
knowing-
tell me, oops, sorry.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm interested, you said there was already a plan that includes the road that's coming?
Yeah, we can look at that again. So this is a separate approved plan for a property with separate ownership to the north of the site. That's showing the road that would go, and it would just connect, so this is the northern border of the site, and where I put the text Z2319 site, the property is located to the south. So that road would just be an entrance.
Okay.
I'm not familiar with this particular one. What is this now zoned for? What is planned to go there?
This is an R4 zoning, and they're planning a residential development with detached homes.
That was my question. Thank you. Any other questions for staff? If not, we'll bring up the applicant to answer some of the questions that were asked. All right. Ms. McClellan, could you come forward, please?
I have an engineer here.
Okay.
That will speak.
All right, thank you.
Good morning. To answer the question that you had.
Could I get your
I'm
name
sorry,
first,
Tim
name
Now, of
and
the
address?
Now Company, 4244 Bond Lily Drive, Wake Forest. The question that you had, no, the density would get a lot less, but the creek is a problem. And there's only one way to have a smaller road. The Raleigh has like a 55-foot section that they want you to put through there to connect to that road. And you can't get across that creek unless you got $300,000 to pay for it. So what we're trying to do is find a way for her to develop her property with townhomes on a single lot. And excuse me, I'm a little cold. So if we could use a 20-foot roadway around that corner, we can get development on the west side and that northeastern side. Does that make sense?
So an internal road, not really a...
Yeah, it would be like almost a public street, or a private street, excuse me. And that's a minimum of 20 foot wide, I think, from what I'm reading in the ordinance. And so the townhomes would be on a single lot. They wouldn't have to have, it would be kind of like the HOA would manage the property, and it would be a private road through it so that they wouldn't have to put that 55-foot section in there. Okay. Talking to some environmental guys, and the mitigation fees that go with taking out about 200 feet of creek are pretty hefty. So we're just trying to look for a solution so she can develop the property in some way.
Okay. I guess that makes sense. We can ask Jason.
But townhomes, I mean, that wouldn't preclude that being redeveloped as single family, that 20-foot road, correct?
Well, single family requires a public street frontage, unless it's a cottage court, which we don't have really room for with the two pieces. So the only real option with trying to get away from that 55-foot road section and right away. The only thing that I could see in there that we could do would be a cottage court, where it says we're a little limited on width to do the alley on one side, and we can connect to the public road. So the townhomes can be on one big, huge lot, multiple buildings, and they wouldn't have to worry about that 55-foot right away. And that was kind of the solution for it, because of the way it was recombined back in the day. It's really there's not much you can do with it.
So I just want to make sure I'm hearing this correctly. So the reason that townhomes are being proposed is because single-family homes are more or less precluded by the need of a public road?
Correct.
And is that staff's opinion as well?
Well, yeah, I mean, under the UDO, every new lot has to have public street frontage.
Okay.
So the situation that this property finds itself in, where subdivision occurred that created a completely landlocked parcel with no access to anything, would not be permitted. It's one of the reasons why the standard's in the code. Currently, it's also not permitted to have townhouse lots fronting on a purely private street.
I wondered about that.
But you just voted on TC 1D18, which changes that, and assuming that goes through City Council smoothly, then that would be adopted law probably by the time that these folks would be ready to submit a development application, assuming, of course, that the zoning also gets approved. So, but under current law, you would still have to put a public street of some description in.
Well, the street, we would bring the street across the creek, but
Right.
it would stop, and then that would be the connection.
Private road.
Yeah.
So there is no mechanism that would allow single-family homes to be developed here instead of townhomes with the constraints of the property?
Not single-family homes sitting on their own lots. The only provisions in the code, well, right now, there's no provisions in the code for lots that don't have public street access. And pending text changes would allow you to have lots that don't have public street access if they're townhouse lots or if they're cottage court lots. Two separate text changes, but you've reviewed and voted on both of them. They're still not adopted law yet.
But if.
And the other way to do it is to condo.
anyway.
You can condo the land and have structures, but that's typically when people think about single family, they're talking about fee simple lots.
Right.
You can condo the land and basically not subdivide it, and then you can have private access drives with buildings fronting on those. You'd have to have zoning that would permit all those structures.
But if the cottage court, as written right now, were in place, could this be developed as two separate cottage courts connected by a private road?
I mean,
Just
we'd have to go
for
back and
yucks.
look at the cottage court dimensional standards to see if that would work. It would certainly be an unusual layout compared.
Kind of cottage courts to begin with, a little bit, kind of, sort of.
Well, I think if you think about, I think the current zoning with R6 or R10 is 60 and 50 feet for the cottage court. That's the same problem we have that road, and then you've got to add alleys behind it to connect. You know what I mean? So that 50-foot spacing between would be great. I mean, I like them, but if you think about the 55-foot roadway that's, being so cumbersome, it would be kind of the same thing. I just don't think there's the room to have it. On average, I would say the width on that northern section is probably 170 feet.
It wouldn't alleviate the problem of connecting the two sides.
Yeah. Getting to the other side is the trick. If there's a way to get around that corner, that would be the way to do it.
If I may, I had one point of clarification on the road question. The property has an access easement currently that goes to Woody Hill Drive. However, transportation confirmed that this access easement would not be permitted to be used should a townhome development be approved for this site. The access easement would only provide access to a single-family detached dwelling on the site. And looking at Jason in case he has anything extra to add, but I just wanted to provide that additional information.
But just to be clear about that, so if this were a single-family housing across this whole site, that connection would be there, but you would still have to have a private road within, right? Because there is not enough space for a public road.
I'm not sure I understood the question completely, but
So if this were to develop as single-family homes,
right.
that would allow this connection to Woody Hill Road.
This connection here.
No.
This connection here. The way I would describe it, and my understanding of the subdivision requirements, is that you cannot access a subdivision from that location. You could access a single-family home from that location.
Just one single-family.
Which might mean that somebody might subdivide it, let's say there, and have a house here and a house here, and have the driveway off of there and a driveway off of the stub there. That's probably possible. Conceivably, you could get a driveway through here and put a house here and another house here and use that access point. But you cannot build a stub of public street to that location, use that access to get into the subdivision. It'd be for one lot that could use that access. And actually, and I'm not absolutely certain that, are these 2 lots currently?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think you'd have to do a recombination in order to use that access, because if you were subdividing it, the subdivision would have to have access from the subdivision's public street system. Did that answer the question?
I think what you're telling me is through some gymnastics of recombination and subdivision, you could get single-family homes that have driveways onto these streets for the upper site. And I'm not clear about the site to the west of the power lines, but it sounded to me like there was possibility for 1 house, maybe 2 over there. I'm not sure.
I believe that to get any more than 2 lots, because there's already 2 lots, you would need to do a subdivision,
right,
which would require a public street. Now, where those 2 houses would be and how would those 2 lots be configured through recombination, that's maybe something Sarah and her colleagues could help figure out, but I'm not.
Well, we had a lot of mail about a desire to see this developed as single-family homes to fit into what is going on around it, and we have a development that's occurring just north of this that is single-family homes R4. So I'm trying to see if there's a way that this could be developed with single-family homes. I was not aware of the public road issue that is driving this towards townhomes until today. So I don't know whether that merits further study or whether people are ready to just vote on this case as it stands. But anyway, that's new information, and I'm pondering it.
I'm going to add one more creative thinking here that may be a little bit out of turn, but one of the reasons for not being able to get a public street through that space is the width and our right-of-way requirements. The public street doesn't necessarily need to be in the same zoning district. So if this area here, if those property owners would be willing to sell and make that a part of that subdivision, then you'd be able to get that public street through here. But that involves property that the applicant doesn't, control, and probably they wouldn't be, from what I'm hearing, may not be interested in selling for that sort of thing. But technically, that could be possible in the future.
So it's just that narrow piece there that is keeping the public road from being produced.
There's not a zoom in any closer to this, is there? Maybe. I was going to say, where's the subdivision plan? Right here. So I'm going to draw on here a little bit to, I think, explain part of what the applicant's engineer was saying. So this is the stream, and to get one crossing here is both an infrastructure expense and a permitting activity. There's not enough space to snake through a public street kind of in this location on the property. So the only other way to do it would be to try to cross it again, but you can't really get 2 crossings permitted. It's twice as expensive, and it's also generally not allowed through the environmental regulations. So you're kind of pinched given the alignment of the creek relative to the property lines.
All right, thank you. More questions for staff or the applicant? So I gather there are a number of people here for this case. Could you please stand and just, all right, thank you. Thank you for coming out. So not unless we move to have folks speak. We've gotten lots of letters and communication, but it may be the will of the commission that we have folks speak. I will turn it over to the commission to decide how we want to proceed. Do we want to hear more public input? Do we want to send staff and the applicant off to talk about an alternative, or are we ready to vote on this today?
Well, I'd be happy to hear from from a representative of that large group for 3-4 minutes, 4 minutes.
All right, then we need equal time. So are you making a motion for 4 minutes for?
We just heard from the applicant.
We asked questions.
Okay, yes.
All right.
Equal time.
All right. So 4 minutes for the, do you want to start with the opponents or the applicant?
Up to you.
Okay. So typically we give 2 minutes per person. So if 2 people want to come up and speak in opposition, please come forward. You have 2 minutes each.
Did you vote?
Oh, sorry, didn't vote. You made the motion, right?
I move to do that.
Do we have a second? All right. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay. Sorry, I got ahead of myself.
Kirkstall, 8837 Woody Hill Road. There's been a lot of discussion all morning about density and character, and that pretty much made my speech for me. You know, we care about our neighborhood. I think the existing land use regulations allow for interpretation, and if your interpretation weights the character argument, then it really doesn't conform. Now, everybody surrounding this parcel bought their properties as long ago as 40 years ago in one case, and as recently as February, based on R2 and a future land use plan that said low-density residential. We think the staff report, I like Sarah's presentation here today. It does tend to downplay the neighborhood issues and the infrastructure issues. We just would like to see common sense applied. You know, look at the surrounding area, you know, drop townhouses into that. It just doesn't fit. It's not an engineering calculation. It's subjective, you know, dropping townhouses in the midst of an area with rural character, 1.25 acre average lot size, rural roadways, no street lighting. We think it just doesn't fit. We have numerous examples of high quality infill development in our area. Even right in Springdale Estates, there's a little brand new 4-lot subdivision, R4. We also have townhouse where it belongs, adjacent to major thoroughfares or bordering commercial. One's been there a long time, one just broke ground at Lynn and Leesville. We're not opposed to infill development. It's going on all over the area. We just think it needs to fit.
Thank you. Do we have somebody else that wants to speak for 2 minutes?
Hello, I'm Cindy Pittman. I live at 5009 Field and Stream Road in Springdale Gardens, and I am a recent addition. I moved there just 2.5 years ago, and I'll give my experience. We got to the property, we weren't even leaving kind of our midtown area too much, and we were waiting for our realtor to get there, and we walked around, and we were in the woods, and it was beautiful, and we're surrounded by 60-foot trees. I can't tell you how much we enjoy this neighborhood. And we want to maintain that character. It is so unique. I was born and raised in Cary. I've seen how development over the last 40 years has changed in Wake County, and I mean, I've really enjoyed the development and growth of my community, but we are a city of oaks. We do have this lovely transition from urban through suburban to more rural areas that it is what draws the unique character and flavor of our neighborhoods, draw people to Raleigh, that you can still live like you grew up in a small town at the extremities of Raleigh and still have access to the wonderful things we have access to. It's important to preserve that here in Raleigh, North Carolina. And I really hope you will see fit that our neighborhood character is worth preserving. Thank you.
Thank you. So, yes. So please come forward. Be sure to state your name, please. I mean, we know you, but state your name.
Good morning. My name is Janet McGlynn, 119 Lincoln Court. I'm the owner and the applicant of the rezoning case Z2319. Today, I'm asking for your approval for rezoning my property from R2 to R10. If approved, the land will be developed in a way that will be consistent with the comprehensive plan and future planning. The proposed development at R10 with conditions I have offered will benefit the city of Raleigh by developing quality attached homes as an affordable alternative to the surrounding detached homes in the area. I ask that you consider the following when you make your decision. The character of the existing neighborhood of Springdale Estates and Gardens south and west of my property will not be lost as was charged. My proposed development will be annexed to the city of Raleigh and will have no impact on their private utilities and services. The setbacks, additional forestation, and more conservation of trees that I offer as conditions will provide a buffer that will separate the subdivision and eliminate visual intrusions for Springdale. The lots of Springdale community where I share property lines have very deep lots. Some of the homes are distanced even more by the power line easement. The footprints of their homes will be substantially distant away from the footprints of my attached homes. If R10 rezoning with conditions will eliminate visual intrusions of the development from within the neighborhood of Springdale, how can it change the character of the neighborhood? I have offered conditions reducing the number of units to a density of 6 per acre instead of 10, which allows more free space for more trees. This is consistent with the
Thank you,
future.
Ms. McLean.
I
Thank
could
you.
too.
Yes. So do we have someone else that wants to speak? So that was your 2 minutes.
Okay, I had some other things that I wanted to express to you, but I'll follow the rules.
All right, thank you. Does anyone want to extend time for Ms. McGlynn?
Sure.
Okay.
Another 2 minutes?
All right.
Nobody else speaking in favor?
Okay. Let me get my place. Don't start the clock yet.
So, so we need to vote on that?
But you've already voted to give 4 minutes to both sides. So.
All right, so we can just use this other 2 minutes for Ms. McGlynn? Okay, all right, so we'll do that.
Okay. Well, I said I had reduced the number. R10 allows that road width that we were talking about, and without it, development is impossible. For your approval, I am willing to offer additional conditions that you suggest that will enhance consistency. Now, I want to make a comment about the large numbers here. On the evening of the 9th of October, the Springdale community and Northwest CAC members numbering well over 200, overwhelmingly and enthusiastically with claps, cheers, and high fives, voted no for my case. According to the officials, the crowd was the largest response to a zoning case that they have ever known. I stood up before the vote and asked the members what conditions I could add to make them more comfortable for a yes vote. I received only one response, more trees, and that was just dismissed and ignored for discussion. This decision, sad to say, was expected, even though I have offered to them early on conditions to R10 that would eliminate the concerns that the community expressed to me at the first meeting of the 50 or so neighbors. At the neighborhood meeting, they were the neighbors who reside within 500 feet of my property. They have now changed the narrative, and there has been added groundswell of people other than the neighbors who vowed to block this decision with their petitions, and they vowed to use their influence to get a denial for me. Their actions are reminiscent of 50 years ago, where racial bias played a big part in my family's loss of land. Today is it is the change of character in the neighborhood that is used. Alan Head said that we would lower, if we develop our property, that we would lower the property values.
Thank you. All right, let's bring it back to the table. What's your pleasure? Do we want to discuss?
This is a head scratcher. This is 2 lots connected by that little bridge through the,
Just connected, just adjacent lots, correct?
where are the lot lines now, sir?
Approximately, the lot line is in this general vicinity of the power line easements.
Yeah. So, were this case to rezone just the eastern site, is there any way to get to the other side?
I'm pausing because I'm thinking about the code requirements for road connection and the width in that area.
So there's always a way to get to the site, right? And I think the question you're really asking is what would be the yield on development of the site?
Right.
So because the applicant controls both properties, there could be an access easement that's granted, but that access easement would only serve one dwelling unit. The challenge here is how the sites as combined are relatively skinny at that pinch point, which is around 55 feet in width, would not support a full width right-of-way. So what the applicant, I believe, has discussed to date is, and it fits nicely with the townhouse development style, is a multifamily street which is much narrower. It's a 22-foot wide section of right-of-way that would provide access to the site to the west.
There's no way in to that western portion of the site?
Not to staff's knowledge, no.
Did I hear correctly that we know that this street will fit that little space?
I'm not certain if you heard that from the applicant or not. Staff has not done that analysis.
Can you point out, excuse me, where the protective yard and the adjacent 2 properties to Wood Hill Road are?
Yes, it would be along, and this is rough approximation, it would be bordering these properties, and it specifies in the conditions the pins of the properties, so where you see my red line would be the location.
So that's 2 properties right there? Okay. Thank you.
There's not a protective yard on the west side?
The applicant did not propose one on the west side.
This might be more of a question, I guess, for whoever has the answer, but currently as it stands, what kind of tree protection is there for these 2 lots being outside of the ETJ?
So the code would require 10% tree conservation for it. The current, under the zoning, I understand it's outside the ETJ, but our zoning would still apply to it, and that's part of why we're seeing it before you today. 10% would be the requirement should this be approved. 15% is the requirement under R2, so there would be a reduction in tree conservation should this be approved.
But 15% of the 6+ acres?
That's right, that's today's requirement.
Well, Mrs. McGlynn is asking what conditions she could add that would make this palatable to her neighbors, and I can't answer that question, but I could suggest that she condition the number of units down from 6 per acre to something less and offer a greater degree of tree conservation, and perhaps that would help get some buy-in from your neighbors. Something for you to consider, perhaps?
It sounds like there hasn't been a discussion. It sounds like there hasn't been willing parties to discuss it, which is disappointing.
I agree.
In an undisturbed tree buffer along, as adjacent to existing homes, I mean, is it reasonable to look at something like that, given the proposed redevelopment?
That's certainly something that we can work with the applicant to look into should they be willing to offer that as a condition.
Okay.
Did you have a question?
Well, I have a comment. You say, what was your question?
Is there a way to provide an undisturbed tree buffer between, tree buffer along, or as adjacent to the single-family homes of what you're proposing?
Their yards come out. They're big lots.
Right.
And I'm adjacent to, to the back. Their backyard. Okay, that is all woods. And that's what they used to go into camp and stuff like that.
Right.
So it's thick wooded. It's thick wood. Now they did, but these are older and they don't remember their children. But the place is wooded.
Right.
Uh-huh.
And I think
It's wooded now. You can't see in there from the streets. You can't see in there. It's thick woods. And I'm gonna make it thicker so that they don't see anything.
well, and I think that's kind of what I was curious about. Is there a way to reduce that to a condition on this proposal to give maybe, I don't know what the number is, so I'll let y'all work through that, but maybe a 50 or 100-foot undisturbed tree buffer that would be part of your property, as
Yes.
it would relate to where it backs up to the single-family homes. I mean,
Yes.
that may be something that everybody could get, find some support for. Just a
think the only-
suggestion.
I think we could do something like that. I think the only problem is that one corner with the one house getting
Well,
around.
and I think that would be where you would have to define, and it starts to get very specific, and I know that could be problematic, but
Yeah.
I think if you could go through and do that, because as I see it, unless I'm missing something, there is not, practically speaking, there's not a way to redevelop this unless it is townhomes. Just
For the most part,
from
yeah.
what I'm hearing, and that's, I
Yeah,
hate
well-
to see somebody, just not be able to do anything with their property.
Yeah.
So, to the extent that we could find some amenable solution to it, I think would be good. If there were a way to do even a small, could be a smaller yield, single family, but from what I'm hearing, the street difficulty, I'm not sure if that's actually even possible.
Yeah, the western part of the site would have to be something that
Where you
currently
could have
fits
one
with
single
that
family come
single
as a
road.
driveway going over there, and then do something, maybe one or two lots off of another driveway on the other parcel. I guess it would only be one, if I'm hearing that correctly.
How many parcels are?
Alternatively, whoever owns that little notch of land that would allow a road to be built across there could sell it to you.
They will not. I guarantee
Well,
you that.
They don't think they have to, but if the alternative is townhomes that they don't want, and right now that is the alternative, because this site is undevelopable except as townhomes, but with a wider road connection, it could be developed as houses. Am I understanding that right?
I would ask the engineer. He's talking about this little foot that sits in there.
Yeah, if we can get that access and avoid that creek interference, that would get a road over there. The yield would go down dramatically.
Yeah, it would. I think that's what these folks want.
Yeah.
So maybe if they sold you a little bit of property there, they could get what they want. Just a thought.
Well, that's if. That's if.
So, I've suggested something you can do, Mrs. McGlynn. I'm suggesting something you all can do as well. And I do agree with Matt. You should be talking to each other.
Well, it's very difficult because this property, they don't want it disturbed. They really don't want it disturbed at all.
How many properties
They
are
tell, I
the
don't care
western
what
side of?
they say up here. I know better.
So, in the interest of time,
I was just going to ask, on the western side of the property, how many parcels or homeowners or property owners on the western side? Just two? 4?
So it seems to be that there's a lot of discussion left and, these kinds of questions. And Mr. Tomasulo has suggested that perhaps we need some more conversation about this case, and perhaps, does it make sense for us to send it into committee of the whole where we can have the applicant and members of the neighborhood come and talk with us and have some more time? What does staff think about that?
Conferring based on your current meeting calendar, you'll need a time extension to send it to committee of the whole. Yes, because there's not one in November.
Yes, because of the holiday schedules, we're running into some committee of the whole meeting restraints, and we do have cases in there. So I'm
Are we
looking
still in
to
discussion, or is the discussion over?
Here?
Yeah. I have a
Well, if
statement
we
I'd
wanted
like to make if I could.
Yeah, if we wanted to move it to committee of the whole, I'd like to bring the conversation to a close. But if
In that
if we're
case, if
gonna,
I could add a
sure, yeah.
statement to
But
the
I don't know that
conversation.
we're going to do that. But go ahead, please.
Okay, yeah, I wanted to make a statement in support of the development. I'm impressed by the tenacity of Miss McLean's family in holding on to this property for 140 years. I wonder how many of us in this room have a story like this in our families. I know that my family was unable to hold on to any of our home places over the generations, and we are white. While it is understandable that neighboring residents of the adjacent 40-year-old neighborhoods are upset by development of this beautiful piece of land, and some may feel hurt by feeling associated with past wrongs against Miss McLean's family in relation to this piece of land, we need to remember that their hurt does not take away those past wrongs. Miss McLean's connection to and right to this land is deeper than any of her surrounding neighbors. Infill townhouse developments like this are happening all over Raleigh and are in our city's best interest as we try to mitigate sprawl and develop multimodal transit options in an effort to mitigate climate change. The proposed development is at the relatively low density level of 6 units per acre, which keeps it in the same future land use map zoning category as the existing adjacent neighborhoods. The large forested lots adjoining this parcel provide much more buffering between neighbors than most other areas of Raleigh. This may have the negative impact of minimizing neighborhood connections with the new development, but it should also provide the distance from this development that seems to be desired by neighbors who are opposed. I will be voting in favor of this case.
So what's your pleasure? Should we send it to committee? Should we hold it for more conversation? Or are we ready to vote?
I guess, thank you for that. I missed in my diligence that there was that much history with this land, and seeing at the age of the neighborhoods around this, can only assume certain things as far, I mean, it's relatively new. It's less than 30 years old, all of it, or less than 40 years old at least. Okay. Well, it's a lot younger than
the 140
than they've been
years
there.
that her grandfather had it.
Yeah.
So I respect your time, but still the 140 years that we're talking about in history. Proceed.
And I just, I missed some of that, and that helps clarify a little bit for me, and I fall in line with your sentiments. Initially I'd wanted to hear some of more of the consideration, but the context is a little bit different now.
I think as this case stands now, I probably would vote for it. I would like to give the neighbors an opportunity to talk about making enough land available to Mrs. McLean that she could build houses on this site rather than townhouses, or a smaller number of townhouses. If that doesn't happen, then I think I probably will vote yes.
Again, what are our time constraints?
Well, I would suggest we just hold it at the table and make.
Right, but I'm not sure what our date is for this case. What is the date?
January 6th?
January 6th, is that right?
December 9th is the deadline for action if extension
Oh, there
is
it
not
is, down at the
requested.
bottom. So we have time to hold it, and
Yeah, I'm going to move that we hold it and give folks a chance to work out something that they like better than this townhouse development. But otherwise, I think this is what's going to be built.
so is that a motion
Yes.
to hold it at the table for until the 12th of November? Is that right?
Yes.
November. December 9th.
If it's the
Right, but our meeting is the 12th of November. So we have to move it out of here by the 9th of December, but our meeting is the 12th of November. So does anyone want to make a second?
Second.
All right, any more conversation? Not today, not today. We're not taking any more comments today. So
Just to clarify,
Vehicle to accomplish it, I think the property owners do want to come to an accommodation and like what's been said. And I think that's really what's coming down. Thank you for your comment. The question is, how can you work to get what the city wants and at the same time accomplish what the neighborhood wants? That's really what it's coming down to. If we would, then we'd be human beings trying to work for a common solution versus conflict. Thank you.
thank you.
Well, so if you make an offer, and we're aware of the offer, I mean, make us aware of the offer.
We're saying there hasn't really been a dialogue.
Yeah, and-
CAC, and what I'm saying is, when the committee, excuse me for saying I'm running out of order, but when the committee is saying this, all I'm saying, that's great, we don't really have a vehicle to do that. And that's what it really comes down to, because I've been working in my position with the homeowners, and the question is, I've asked them, what do we want, because
Yeah,
it's going to be developed.
I think we're going to have to cut you off there. So, Ms. McLean, are you willing to meet with the neighbors between now and the 12th of November? So it seems to me that that this is a private discussion that we can't facilitate, that you guys are going to have to figure out how to facilitate. And so I'm sorry that I don't believe there's any way that we can take that on. I'll look to staff and our attorney to ask for any other venue other than this is something that they have to privately go off and work out and come back to us with. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah,
So
any
that's-
additional conditions the applicant would have to offer.
Right, so that's something that is going to have to happen between the two sets of parties. So hopefully you can come back to us on the 12th of November with some additional conditions or some change in the state of the case or the state of the property that will make it more palatable to all. So thank you for your time today and for your concern.
So you have on
We
the
have
table a motion and a second.
Yeah,
I don't
so we
know.
have a motion and a second. Sorry, there's so much going on.
What, was it seconded? I didn't hear a second.
Tika's seconded, so
that's
we're
to hold to the
to hold
next
to the
meeting.
table,
Okay.
to the 12th.
Okay.
Yeah,
Either way, I'm comfortable at holding it or voting today.
all right.
That's my
So, so, any more discussion before we take our vote? Okay,
I wonder if there's enough interest in just voting today?
well, that can be a substitute motion.
I would recommend if you
We need to vote on,
procedurally, if you wanted to kind of get a vote on that, and then depending on the outcome, you can choose your next motion.
Is there enough time if this were held at the table to add conditions? Okay, just double check. Thanks.
so you're saying vote on whether we should vote, I'm sorry.
You have a motion and a second right now
So
on
we have to
whether or not
finish.
to hold it for 2 weeks.
Okay, so we need to see if there's enough support for that before we take another motion.
Well, I would get a vote on that motion. before
Okay,
you-
all right. So no more discussion, so we'll vote on this, and then if there is enough support to hold it at the table for 2 weeks, that's what we'll do. If there's not, then we will
Entertain another motion.
entertain another
Are we
motion.
voting on
Holding it,
Now, or hold
Motion on the
holding it?
table right now is to hold it, right.
Okay.
hold it till the 12th of November, which is not 2 weeks, it's 3 weeks. So,
Next meeting.
yes. So, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed?
No.
So, could the noes hold up their hand? So just two. Okay. All right, so,
I'm really, I'm ready to vote for it, or we can.
well, we've just voted to,
Show of
So-
hands of who said, I wasn't sure either.
so there were only two.
So if we're gonna vote for it, if,
No.
I'll vote for it
The
today.
question is
So-
to hold at the table.
We're not,
So to hold at the table, then I'm saying no.
all right, so there are three
It's for show
noes
of
to
hands
hold
for
at
the
the table.
noes.
For the noes to hold it at the table, please raise your hands. All right, so that's three. So we will hold it at the table until the 12th.
So we've just heard from the applicant, she can't be here on
Mm.
November 12th,
Okay,
so that would push you until.
to the
your-
26th.
That's correct.
Okay. So that gives you a lot of time to work out some discussions and hopefully something that is more in line with both parties. Thank you. I know this is a difficult case, and I'm sorry for the need to go back again and have more discussion, but I'm hoping it will yield a better outcome. So thank you. So we're going to move on to the next case now. Was it?
I don't think I've ever heard a more interesting.
So I'm waiting for the room to clear before we pick up the next case.
Well, I wasn't that clarified. These folks need to help her build something. Yeah.
Okay, moving on to, we took care of Tarboro Street, so moving on to Z3218, South Saunders PD. And this, I'm sorry, was that? We dispensed with that at the beginning of the, yeah, you weren't here. So, all right, so Z3218.
Sure. So Z3218 is South Saunders Street PD. This was before you previously. Was reported out of committee of the whole without a recommendation, and then held at the table to allow the applicant some time to make revisions to the case. There have been several revisions to the case, and I will go over what those are, and they've also been updated in the staff report, but just to go back to the basic overview, it's a request to rezone about 9 acres from residential mixed use with a 3-story height limit and industrial mixed use with a 3-story height limit to planned development. The Southwest CAC recommends approval and a vote of 17 yes to 1 no. And the deadline for action is Wednesday, November 20th, 2019. I'll just go briefly through the overview, and there's a number of hidden slides in here, so if any more details necessary, I'm happy to unhide the slides, but just for the sake of brevity, and since this has already been before you a couple times, we just sort of cut to the chase on some of it. So the zoning in the area, it's a mixture of industrial mixed use 3, and then there's some R10 and R3. It's kind of a hodgepodge of different things. Just to give some perspective where the site's located, it's a triangular parcel between South Saunders and the South Dawson McDowell Street, and then Western Boulevard is at the top, and this is the Gateway Plaza apartment complex that borders the site, as well as the Rocky Branch Creek and Greenway. This is the Greenway roughly drawn as you see that green line flowing through there. This is a zoomed in view of the site just to give better perspective on where it's located. So the green and blue are respectively representing the Greenway as well as the Rocky Branch Creek that run through the top of the site. And again, it borders the Gateway Park apartment complex to the north and has South Saunders and South Dawson Street as its borders on the north or on the west and the east. A few different views to give some perspective of the site since it's a fairly large piece of land and it fronts on a number of streets. Just pause for a moment to let folks take in the views of the current site. And I have an additional slide with some additional views of the site, just as it's a large parcel to give perspective. So this is looking in from Dawson Street. This is looking in from South Saunders Street. And you have seen this before, and I'll just breeze through this, what a planned development is. It's a special district that allows for a customized zoning district. So as the applicant will not necessarily be offering conditions, as this is a general use rezoning case, the applicant can offer revisions to the case, which they have done, that can shift the consistency of it. These are the chapters that can be modified by a PD in the UDO, so it's a variety of things from the residential mixed-use districts, some of the use regulations, development standards, and what have you, as well as some of the street dimensions. Again, a basic overview of the site. The applicant proposed the plan in what they're referring to as a series of pods. So the pods are these areas that have defined development intensities in them, and they have a maximum intensity as well as uses specified in the plan that was submitted. These are some updates from the resubmittal. So the applicant has shifted the consistency on a number of policies by providing some new, I keep wanting to call them conditions. They're not conditions, but some revisions to the case. So they are things such as pedestrian-facing entrances will be required along South Saunders Street. And there's some additional detail the applicant provided, but I summarized it for the sake of brevity here. They're also requiring ground floor active uses along South Saunders Street and minimum 50% ground floor transparency along South Saunders Street. And just as a point of clarification, these are likely provided along South Saunders Street because this is the street that fronts along the road, South Dawson. Dawson Street over here is a controlled access roadway that does not have a sidewalk on it and does not provide an ideal pedestrian environment. So the applicant is responding to comments from staff about the Main Street designation and the urban form designation for the area along South Saunders Street specifically. So these addressed some policy inconsistencies and shifted them to consistent. They also shifted the vision theme of growing successful neighborhoods and communities to consistent from its previous inconsistent status. A couple more resubmittal updates that weren't tied directly to a policy and are do not necessarily affect consistency one way or the other, where at least 5% of the units will be no larger than 550 square feet. I'll just mention there's no policy shift here because the current policies don't necessarily speak to unsubsidized affordable housing or micro units, so there was no direct policy to tie that to. The applicant is also requiring a minimum of 30 feet separation between buildings within the same pod, and again, those pods are those sectioned off areas that have specific development intensities in them as set forth in the plan. So 30-foot separation between buildings in the same pod for towers greater than 7 stories. And again, these are summaries of what the applicant submitted. They provided a little more detail that's in the staff report. And they also required a difference of height between the tallest and the shortest buildings within the pod. Just to show the existing versus the proposed zoning. So this will be going from residential mixed use and industrial mixed use, the 3-story height limit, to a PD with a proposed 20-story height limit. The residential density would increase substantially, and the maximum units would increase substantially as well. These setbacks would decrease as the applicant is proposing 0 lot line setbacks for parking as well as for the buildings on the site. A little more additional detail on what's being proposed. It would allow for a fairly large increase in office industrial space, and there's an asterisk there because the applicant couched those two together for the sake of site plan review and the sake of ease in that, so that's allowing for both of those uses. That is the maximum intensity. The retail intensity would increase as well, and then the industrial would decrease. And again, there's some industrial uses allowed, so that's being reflected in the office industrial square feet that was lumped together as one category. This is consistent with the future land use map, and it has been consistent since it was initially submitted, so no changes here. It is now consistent with the Main Street urban form designation. This is an update to the case from when it came before you previously. As you can see, this green line in there is indicating that the plan recommends a Main Street designation along South Saunders, which would suggest a pedestrian-friendly environment that has pedestrian-facing entrances, active ground floor uses, and setbacks that are pulled up close to the street. The applicant has provided all of those things in the most recent update to the application. There are still some outstanding issues, however. The case remains inconsistent overall with the 2030 Comprehensive Plan, and those inconsistencies are related to things that you saw before you previously, such as a lack of codification of some of the design elements that are described in the narrative and that are also suggested by policy for an area that would be a gateway site, as well as a planned development, which generally suggests that a higher quality of design should be required in lieu of relief from some code requirements. The request will also result in some intersections that will be below the comprehensive plan's level of service standards, and I will clarify this is a policy piece, not so much as a regulatory piece from the UDO. And then let's see, the other items are revision to the narrative to provide a 16-foot wide streetscape was not reflected in the plan sheets, as well as a revision to a public access easement that would allow for a wider sidewalk. I would like to say the applicant provided these revisions and we reviewed them and they are consistent, and these outstanding issues will go away with the next iteration. It's just they were not received in time for the staff report update, so I have to keep them here as a somewhat procedural measure. And just to summarize, since there's a lot of information in this case, these are a couple items that are still the staff report identified as inconsistent with the plan, that the height and entitlement that the request is proposing would create some traffic issues in the area, and one mitigation that could be sought would be a reduction in either of those. Codification and high quality design elements that are described throughout the narrative of the PD that was submitted as well, and that also ties to a couple of plan policies, and then providing 14-foot sidewalks with a minimum of 6 foot. Tree planting areas, and the applicant has provided the 14-foot sidewalk, so that piece is taken care of. However, the tree planting areas remains unchanged in the most recent submission. And then again, just to show some things that the changes that were made to the case, so they specified facade articulation or other coverage outside of structured parking on upper stories, prohibited ground floor structured parking on South Saunders Street in Pod C, and offered pedestrian-facing entrances along the street in pods A, B, and C, and these all helped with the overall consistency of the case. And that, I should say the deadline for action, I'm gonna zoom back up to the first page real quick just to remind folks of that. Okay, the deadline for action is Wednesday, November 20th, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
So before we start in, I just want to make sure I understood you. We have conditions that were submitted too late, and
right,
I'm sorry, revisions that were
Mhm.
submitted too late
Mhm.
for us to vote today and have a complete case. So, all right, seems to be some.
So there was it was a technical issue that the applicant submitted a revision to the narrative but did not submit a plan sheet that reflected the revisions to the narrative. So that now has been resolved. As far as outstanding issues on the case, I suppose it would be at the discretion of the commission how you'd like to proceed on that particular issue, but that's been resolved, the sidewalk piece.
So which piece is not resolved that
So the outstanding
may
issues that
affect whether
remain-
we vote today or not?
The case is still overall inconsistent with the plan. However, I believe procedurally that that would be at your discretion to take action on that, and as well as some general inconsistencies with policy. But as far as procedural technical issues, those have been resolved by the applicant.
Okay, thank you. I gather we're good to go to vote. Yes, today, right? Yes, okay. That's what I was trying to clarify. I thought I understood. All right. Please go ahead. Questions for staff?
Were there any changes on the interior street, the curb to curb?
Yeah, the applicant, I might let him speak to it because he can articulate a little better, but the applicant did submit changes to that.
So, excuse me, Michael Birch with Longleaf Law Partners. So in our last committee of the whole discussion, we had brought forward a proposal that at least 51% of the linear footage of the internal street, the sidewalks on either side, would be the full streetscape width of 16 feet, with the outer 6 feet of that being within the public sidewalk easement. So that, we've continued to bring that forward, and that is integrated into the master plan narrative. I do want to note, just on there was a comment about the 6 foot tree planting area. Just want to note that the tree grate size is 4 feet. That is the standard city detail. And when you talk about a planting area, particularly in a urban setting, the tree grates of a 6-foot wide planting area, 4 feet of that is tree grate, and then an additional 2 feet of that is sidewalk. And so we're not I just want to be very clear, because there was some discussion about this at the last committee, the whole meeting. We are not providing smaller tree grates than what is required. There's nothing affecting the health of the trees and the street trees that we're planting on the interior streets. But what we proposed in committee of the whole still holds, that at least 51% of our internal streetscape will be that full width.
The width of the road, though?
So the width of the back-to-back, curb-to-curb section
Right.
is the same. We are not providing,
So
on-street parking.
Right, but you're not bringing that up to standard?
Again, I think a lot of the discussion about the standard width is about the streetscape, so less about the back-to-back like travel lane section. I think most of the discussion has been focused on the sidewalk width.
Partly, but what am I mean, there's not a dedicated bike lane, correct?
Correct. There's not a dedicated bike lane. And
with the current width that's proposed on the internal street, like you say, there's no parking. There's no turnouts or anything else. I mean, so one car stops and all traffic stops on the internal street, correct?
Right. Actually, we can just get to, okay. I'll just utilize this street. So this is the internal street.
Right.
This is a stop condition here at that intersection.
And that's a one-way street, right?
No. There's there's a travel lane in each direction. You said you have the cross section?
Yeah, I just
I saw it, but it wasn't clear to me.
Yeah, this one might be an old one that doesn't have your full. So this doesn't have your new streetscape in it.
Okay, perfect. So what's on the screen is, this is the minimum streetscape. So this doesn't include the additional 6 feet of, this doesn't include the additional 6 feet of sidewalk outside of that cross-section. But we have, in some cases, here you've got kind of a shared travel bike lane, a travel lane, and then a turning lane. That's where we have, a turn lane condition.
Correct?
It is a shared travel lane and bike lane.
Shared.
Yeah, and the reason for that is, and again, we're just talking about the internal street, and the purpose of this internal street it is not to move traffic. It is to slow the traffic down. So that's why there is not a dedicated bike lane. I think typically you see a dedicated bike lane on higher speed streets where you want to separate the bike from the car. Here, given the anticipated travel speeds of the car, and wanting to emphasize the pedestrian here, there's not that need for a separated bike lane. So that's why it's shared.
Excuse me, aren't you also providing separate bike paths through the property?
That's right. We've looked at, again, there's one there, and includes the bridge. We've got our own bike path on this side of the creek. And again, we are providing the full width of the streetscape along Saunders Street. So really the internal street is meant to, from a vehicle standpoint, is meant to provide vehicular access to the parking decks for those buildings. It's not to, kind of move, traffic. That's all out on Saunders. And so that's why we've gone with the street cross-section that we've provided.
Then do you anticipate all the buildings fronting on South Saunders?
So our conditions essentially require now with the additional urban form standards that we've provided, that we will have buildings, yeah, I mean, there will be buildings fronting along
Right,
Saunders.
all of the buildings.
No,
they
no, I
won't,
mean, we
correct?
will have buildings, we could
Correct.
have, potentially have a building there. So again, the internal street is serving
Correct.
the buildings, but it's not meant as a,
If I'm riding my bike and I want to get to those buildings, I'm going to use that road to get into and park in front of the building.
right, so you're coming right in here. And again, so there's a couple 100-foot length where you're going to be behind a car in all likelihood because of the slow speed at which those cars are traveling. Yep.
So, I just have a comment with some of this. So, I'm in favor of this street design because, through all of kind of my studies in bikeability, walkability, et cetera, this is creating, you can contradict me if you want, but this increases sight lines, it slows traffic down, it makes it easier for bikes, people, and cars to occupy the same space, and which is really popular in other denser areas, particularly overseas. There's these streets called Woonhoofs, which are actually meant to not actually designate car, bike, or people, so that traffic and people and bikes are all going the same speed for safety reasons. And it appears that that's where this is going. It's meant to be more of a driveway, and it's meant to have higher visibility so that if someone walks off the curb, that it's very safe. So it's not meant to move cars. Maybe I'm completely wrong, but that's the way that I'm kind of reading this, is that it's a very urban experience. And just like places in somewhere like North Hills, it has to be safe to walk off the curb of the street and into the street, as opposed to other places that normally, when you're segmenting types of travel lanes, that means that it's for safety purposes, and so you're traveling at higher speeds. I think the goal here is that people are not traveling at higher speeds, and ultimately, people are kind of crawling into different parking decks, and plus I don't think someone's going to build or develop something that's not going to make sense for them. So, I don't want to speak to the developer, but my take on this is that it's intentional because of the density and the urbanity of the context. So.
I'm being, so, I appreciate that. This is showing a 30-foot wide street section, is that right?
For the portion that has a turning lane, yes, yes.
So the lane on the left is labeled travel and bike lane.
Correct.
But the bikes aren't riding in both directions in that lane, are they?
No, that's just going in.
So the next lane should also be travel / bike, or is it the one on the far right that's travel / bike? There's a turn lane in the middle?
Yes, and this was Graham Smith, Landscape Architect Site Collaborative, 821 Wake Forest Road. So the idea is that, kind of back to where Mr. Tomasulo was talking about, that this is showing when it is a turn lane condition, and it's not a left turn lane condition. This is showing when it's a right-hand turn lane condition. We're trying to encourage that into the parking decks throughout the development. And so at that point, yes, the bike lane would be as a sharrow. The through lane for the biker in that situation would be in the travel lane, close to the turning lane. But this is diagrammed what it would look like in a right-hand turn lane condition. So, but there would be two bike lane. It would be sharrowed for both directions.
Cars
absolutely.
going both ways, bikes going both ways.
Yes. Yep.
I misread your.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that confusion.
Two questions just about the lane to the far left that's travel. If they want to go in the parking garage, they'll have to cross the two lanes? It might be a weird question.
Sorry, do you mind repeating?
The car to the far left, that's a travel that's going, the opposite direction. Do they need to turn left to get into the parking lot that would go across two lanes?
Yes, and what this would be is a variant striping. I mean, we haven't
laid out exactly how all these
Sure.
decks would lay out, but the idea is that with 3 lanes, we would have some flexibility. And when we had a right-hand turn, we may have a left-hand movement coming at you, the center lane would work, and so we'd have to possibly jog through there. But the idea is to slow people down,
Yep.
and that people would be driving at a very slow speed through the space, so.
The only other thought that I had that just made me think of, like, you know, if people are stopping to drop people off, because you can have restaurants and stuff in there, like, is that going to back up traffic?
Yes, so we have several spots. The buildings would be articulated back and forth, so it's not a, facade on every one of these pods. I think you guys have seen some of the conceptual work. The idea that the buildings would articulate back and forth, and so there would be some pull-offs and some possibility for some at least, little curbside letting out and stuff.
I did read in here that on-street parking would be allowed on the internal street somewhere. Didn't I read that? In front of,
It may be allowed, but I don't know if it'll.
in front of some buildings.
Not that I'm aware of. Again, we'll have, I think, on-street parking right now is on Saunders on both sides. There's on-street parking that's being maintained on Saunders.
Well, I made a note that parking can be on-street on the internal street. Possibly I misread that.
Yeah, no, I think our cross-section, again, as we talked about in our last committee, the whole meeting, really the difference between what we're providing from a cross-section and what, the city cross-section would provide is that those on-street parking areas. But again, we're intending for all the parking to be in structured parking off of that street. That's right.
All right, we're coming up on noon, folks. I just wanted to give you a heads up. And we have one more case to work through after this and reports. So, are there any more questions, concerns, conversations?
I do have a question.
Okay.
Is there any, and I may have missed it, description about the buildings articulating on the site or the relationship to the street to allow for these moments to drop off? That's kind of codifiable in the proposal?
So, not necessarily at the ground level. I do want to reiterate that we have, removed our requests for varying the, floor plate size, step back standards, those things. We haven't asked to vary at all the blank wall standards. I think what we were trying to get at with the kind of 51% at the full streetscape was to allow for some of those areas to kind of articulate through the development. And again, that's at a minimum. We anticipate, and I think as you saw in some of our slides at the last committee of the whole meeting, we're anticipating some areas that are larger because we have to accommodate our outdoor amenity area adjacent to the sidewalk. They're at a minimum dimension of 10 by 10. We'll have a lot of outdoor amenity area, which is outside of the right-of-way at that ground level that will drive that building placement and location as well.
Is there any assurance that in each of these pods there will be more than one building?
There is not an assurance that there will be more than one building from just a straight standard. Now there are, because of the floor plate size limitations above, I believe it's above 12 stories, theoretically you could have maybe one base of a building and then a tower or two coming up. Again, the pod B is the smaller pod that could potentially have, one base but two towers. And in that case, we've provided for tower separation. But given the size of pod A, I think there's at least, two buildings there. Again, both from a floor plate size standard, if we're going to achieve the heights that we're proposing, which, we've set at a maximum of 20 and 18 stories, then those buildings are going to have to be, or those towers are going to have to be broken up.
In Pod A, then, there is no transition across to the apartments. You're still sticking with 18 to 20 stories there, correct?
Correct. We're staying with the height there. The reason for that is the distance between the buildings in Pod A are a minimum of 150 feet away, and that's a largely kind of fully vegetated area because of Rocky Branch. And additionally, just from a context, as we look at how this area is redeveloping, given its proximity to downtown, proximity to Dick's, we don't think that a 3-story development is going to be the development pattern going forward, not just on our location here, but, you know, to the west, to the east, to the north. And so for those reasons, we maintained our height in Pod A. Again, wanted to be respectful of y'all's time. I think Sarah hit on the changes that we made, largely focused on the urban form along Saunders, but also in building form, requiring the minimum separation between towers, also requiring the minimum difference of at least 2 stories between buildings within the same pod, and then also a commitment to micro units. I want to note, just because traffic has been a discussion, I want to continue to emphasize, as it says in the TIA review letter, that even at max build-out, South Saunders continues to operate at an acceptable level of service. All of the surrounding intersections in the AM peak and the PM peak will continue to operate overall at acceptable levels of service. There are, and no intersection in that area will be degraded below level of service E. There are 2 approaches, or 1 approach at 2 intersections that will possibly be a level of service F in 1 peak hour, and that at the Saunders and South and the Dawson at South intersections. The westbound approach in the PM peak hour may degrade to a level of service F, just that 1 approach, but the overall intersection continues to operate at a level of service B in the AM, C in the PM for the Saunders and South, and then the Dawson and South overall B in the AM, D in the PM. And I think it's important for the commission to understand the volume of that approach. The westbound approach at Saunders and South in that PM peak is only 10% of the total traffic at the intersection. And at the Dawson at South, that minor volume approach is only 4% of the total traffic at that intersection. And so as we thought about mitigations, it did not make sense, particularly Dawson at South, to impede 96% or 90% of the traffic to the benefit of 4% or 10% of the traffic. And so I just wanted to, because traffic's mentioned a lot throughout the staff report, I just wanted to make sure that the commission was aware of those items.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Burch.
Yep,
I'm going to
thanks.
stop you there.
Yep.
So do we have any more questions, conversation? Are we ready to vote?
So there are a lot of reductions to parking requirements in your PD, which I think is good, but there's no maximum on parking, is there?
No, there is no maximum. We are essentially applying the downtown parking standards to this project. I think where you see maximum parking requirements, at least right now in the UDO, is where you have surface parking. But because we anticipate our parking being indexed, there's not a maximum. Yeah.
Well, the DX parking requirements do impose a maximum on residential uses.
Right.
2 spaces per unit, which is twice the minimum of 1 space per unit, setting aside the 16-unit exemption.
This has that? This does not.
I mean, if they're applying the DX, they're saying we'll meet the DX standard, and they're referencing the DX standard, then yes. If they're quoting selectively from the DX standard, then I'm not sure.
So which is it?
Yeah, I didn't see any maximums.
I don't see a maximum.
To be clear, my concern is that this scale of development on this site, I like it if it's served by transit. It's not clear that it's going to be served by transit. Yes, on Western Boulevard.
Well, Western Boulevard, we're within a half-mile walk to Raleigh Union Station. We're a less than a mile walk to the Go Raleigh station at Moore Square. Again, half-mile walk to the Russ Bus site. We have sidewalk access to multiple bus routes and potentially BRT, whether it's on Saunders or on Wilmington.
So with that level of confidence that you just expressed, I would be putting some maximums on my parking, because this, you are leaving it open that you will build to the market, and the market is car-centric. And that this development could feature very large parking decks and a lot of traffic internally and generated to surrounding streets.
Right. I think from a parking deck standpoint, there is a market force that, and let me touch on two things. The cost of structured parking is reaching $60,000 a space. It does not make financial sense to provide more structured parking than is necessary. Additionally, given this site's proximity to Dix Park, there have been discussions about the ability, whether formally or informally, for the public to be able to park at this project to visit Dix. And so there is, on the one hand, a desire to provide sufficient parking to accommodate both the development that's on the ground here as well as what's needed to serve Dix. And there is a countervailing, force that says it doesn't make sense to provide more structured parking than you need. And I think the balance of those two forces will, get us to a point where we've got an appropriate amount of parking on the site without having to impose. We tie a maximum to one use. That doesn't, then we're trying to get around that to make sure that we can provide enough parking that's going to be available to the public to use to access Dix. And I don't think we have, at least at this point in time, an understanding of what that amount of parking, excess parking, is needed to potentially serve that.
I have a comment. I'm ready to move this forward.
Okay.
I think, I don't know where everyone else stands, but I think that we should maintain flexibility for what this can be. It's in a critical kind of gateway for many parts of our growing city. It's very close to, it has to be one of the most proximate developments to various modes of transportation, public space, and goals for our future, and appreciate the, clarifications over the past couple weeks, and want to move this forward. So I move approval. Do I need the formal?
So if I,
with the PD?
Staff report, I believe, recommends this is inconsistent overall with the, or not recommends, states that it's inconsistent overall with the comprehensive plan policies, not the future land use map. So in your motion, you would address comprehensive plan consistency, and you can state that if approved, it would amend those policies as to the specific parcels in this PD only.
How do some of the amendments influence that? Will it be just kind of worked out?
It's just we're just trying to, so under the state law as it is now, it would be an automatic amendment. The good news, starting January 1, 2021, it would only be an amendment to the future land use map. But until then, we're just procedurally making sure we're checking all of our boxes.
Okay. So
then
what she said.
So so I move approval, understanding that the updates will be, the appropriate updates will be made to the comprehensive plan.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
And you, You could say as stated in the staff report.
as stated in the staff report.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Further discussion?
Well, I wish I could vote for this, and I hope it's built, and I hope it comes out to be a great project. It is lacking any sort of affordable housing offer, and I think that's a significant weakness with an entitlement of almost 1,000 residential units.
They did offer micro units,
50.
5%, yeah. I mean, there was some nod to affordability.
Not defined as affordable
Sure,
in any
agreed,
way.
yeah.
1 million square feet of, 1 million, actually 1.3 million. No, it's more than that, 1.5 million square feet of office, retail, hotel. That's a lot. And that's a lot of cars and a lot of potential parking decks, and then parking for Dick's Park. And so from a PD, I would be looking for some real design specificity about how all of that can be fit on a site that is 9 acres and functionally is less than 9 acres because of the Greenway Trail. And this application does not have that kind of specificity at all, as the staff report points out. The design elements that really ought to be part of a PD are not in it. So for those two reasons, I guess most significantly, I'm going to vote no.
Any further?
Yeah, I'm also feeling like I cannot support this at this point. I'm especially concerned with it being inconsistent overall with the 2030 comprehensive plan, and that there are still a number of outstanding issues identified by staff that haven't been mitigated. I like the general idea of the development, and I'm hopeful that some accommodations can be made to bring it into consistency, but I also don't feel that it would be fair to other developers in the area to allow this development to go forward inconsistent as it is.
From my perspective, the length of the inconsistencies still gives me pause, as well as in all candor, the internal street design. I just don't see a reason that can't be more similar to our standard street design, and the other is some type of step down to the residential that this is adjacent to.
I have another question just to address some of this. Procedurally, if some of the considerations that were submitted late were included, would that update staff's interpretation?
Yeah, the sidewalk would shift some of the policies. I'm pausing because I know the real question is, would that shift the overall consistency of the case? And I'm looking at the policies right now that are inconsistent, and that just does not get at a number of policies that are pretty specific to gateway areas in the city and speak to design, codifying design elements, as well as a number of policies that speak to some of the traffic concerns as well. So this would make a small shift, but overall it would not alter the overall consistency of the case.
All right, then let's just move forward.
So I'm similarly conflicted about this case, and I think there are some elements in it that are very desirable, but I also have some concerns about the inconsistency. The lack of stated affordable units is also of concern. I do applaud the micro units being added. I think at this moment I would vote against it. But
So the good news is this will go to council either way, right?
Yeah.
So
yes,
it's moving forward.
We're moving it forward. So we have any more comments before we take a vote? All right, so we have a motion to approve, a second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no.
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 So how many no's do we have? Okay. I counted five, 6.
6 and 3.
And how many opposed? I mean, 4? Okay.
All right, so that means the motion failed, so we need another
Oh, and
motion.
the motion to approve failed,
The
correct?
motion to approve failed, so we need a motion to deny.
That would, yeah, that would be the cleanest way to do it. I would recommend it.
Motion, I'll move to recommend that the council deny this application.
Do we have a
Because
second?
it is inconsistent with the comp plan overall.
Do we have a second? We need-
Second.
So any further discussion? All right, all in favor of the motion to deny a recommendation?
And
say
we're just denying it just based on the comp plan, or, I mean,
There were a variety of statements
okay,
made about why.
okay.
Yeah, you're all,
if
you're
this-
always, your goal, your charge, I guess, under state law is always to recommend based on the comprehensive plan consistency. There's sometimes, things outside that
Right.
you add into your recommendations.
But-
there's the-
But as part of this, he's made the statement that we needed in order to vote, right? So,
Oh, yeah, you're good. I was
okay.
just
All
explaining.
right,
in
yeah,
case there
okay,
was a-
all right. All right, so all in favor of this motion, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed?
No.
So how many
Sorry,
opposed?
I should have been an aye. I'm sorry.
Well, if you don't say anything,
Yeah,
you're an aye.
I'm sorry, I
We're
was
recommending
waiting.
We're all getting
denial.
punchy.
Yeah.
Yes,
How
so,
many was that?
so how many voted against this?
Voted for the motion
How
to
many
deny.
voted
Voted in
against this
favor of
motion?
the-
Motion to
Wait.
deny.
Yeah, how many voted against the motion to deny?
No, against the motion to deny.
Against the motion to deny. So that was 3 of you, the same 3?
Yes.
Same 3. All right, so
She said it should have been at.
Matt and CJ. All right, thank you. Sorry, we're getting punchy. It's been a long meeting. So we're moving on. So that case is going forward to City Council with a recommendation to deny. So we are moving on to Z2219, and I need to ask staff, we are overtime. We're 12:18. What do we do in this circumstance where we have another case and we still have discussion amongst ourselves?
From a
So do
From
we
a
need to?
noticing public standpoint, you're fine, but it's up to you if you want to talk about your timing for, if you want to move your case or anything.
So, I'm sorry, do we need to hear it today, or?
That's, timing-wise, I'm not sure. I'm just saying from a legal public notice standpoint.
I mean, we have,
So we've already noticed the item. Excuse me. So if you want to, just like you did with 2 cases earlier today, you can
Right.
say it's going to be deferred
to the next
until later
meeting.
date.
So
That's
we
right.
just have Mr. Walker here, I think. Is that the last person here to speak on this?
I'm the only one here, and I'll be as quick as you'll have me.
So, are you happy for us to just pick it up again on the 12th of November? Can we just table it and defer it to then?
If you will tell me if you have any conditions you want me to add.
Well, there was one, that's the same one from the other case. So, remember you said if it's going to happen to my case, it needs to happen to week 22, or to Z22 as well.
If there are any other conditions, I would accept the deferral if I hear any more conditions that I can be ready for, so when we show up.
I couldn't think of any. I
Okay.
couldn't.
Okay, so anybody else have anything that they want to provide to Mr. Walker about conditions that he might want to come back with on the 12th?
Mitigating things listed farther down in the report.
Mr. Harden.
Earlier case.
Noose River and Bike Ped Connections were the 2 listed in the staff report, so.
So if there are conditions,
Noose River.
was there a condition suggested for this case as well about bike paths and that have not been incorporated into?
That's right. They were similar in nature to those for the Z21 case.
Similar to that? Okay, so those.
So if you're asking for a connection to the Greenway, is that a direct connection, or is that connection through sidewalks over the bridge and all that? I want to make sure I get that right.
I understand.
This is a commercial center, right? It's not, nobody's going to be living there. It's no residential. So as long as we can get across South New Hope Road, we can get up.
There will be sidewalks on both sides of South New Hope. So if we have a greenway easement to get to the sidewalk to South New Hope and go across the bridge, that's
Seems okay.
I'll accept the deferral.
Thank you.
The buffer on the Neuse River was mentioned, and I can't remember what you said about it, Jason.
So there were a couple of inconsistent policies that were called out in the staff report. The policies that had to do with the water features in Neuse River, that was more comparing what is proposed to the existing zoning, which did set out the northern portion of that property, basically here, as private open space. That portion of the property is stream or wetland. It is largely floodplain, probably likely essentially unbuildable. There's no specific conditions that, as in the existing PD, say that it's unbuildable. So that was the thought process behind that inconsistent policy, that there could be a little bit more direct language, but that essentially that's a unusable portion of the site. And then the second had to do again with what was discussed about pedestrian links to greenways, and one consideration being the crossing here, which presumably would be addressed by a traffic signal or possibly some other means. And then that there is, this is greenway on the north side, that there are currently no specific provisions for connecting this property to that greenway.
We'll take a look.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for taking the deferral. Okay. All right, so now we have, sorry, I got sidetracked. The October 8th Planning Commission meeting minutes.
Sadly, I do have one thing on that. There was a comment for the individual that lived at 310 Heck Street. His name was Stuart Cullinan.
Okay, so with that, understand. So with that correction, or do we have a motion to approve?
Second.
Yeah.
All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, a report from the chair. So we need to look at the upcoming months of November and December around the holidays and vacations. I know that I'm going to be away on the 26th of November, so I'll miss that meeting. Travis and I spoke before the meeting that he's going to send out email.
You should already have it.
Oh, you're so efficient. To collect information about who's going to be available for which meetings. So please try to make sure that you nail down which meetings you're going to be available for, so that we are sure we have quorum for meetings that we're supposed to have. And we'll work that out.
Before Thanksgiving?
Yeah, I'll be gone the Tuesday before.
I will as well.
So we need to make sure we're going to have quorum, or if we don't, we have to not have that meeting, right? So, or move it. Can we move a regular planning commission? All right, so that's a possibility, but let's at least get people's schedules, because it may be that a lot of people are missing, that makes it difficult to do that. So also, did you check to see if the committee assignments mail was sent out?
I just resent it while
Okay, so you resent it.
If you didn't get it before, you have it now.
Okay, so please check your mail, because what's on the website is still incorrect.
Yep.
And also, I noticed that Tika, when I was looking at committees, Tika's still listed as being in your second term that ended on the 19th of March. So that has not been updated. So yeah, we need to get that straightened out as well. Yeah, I was just looking for what was not up to date out there, and that was one of the things I noticed. All right, so report from the members. Report from the planning director.
So I'll briefly run down the council items. I have one additional thing. Two items were approved: TC 819, which is the mechanical and plumbing examining boards and housing appeals boards text change, and Z 1019 on South Bloodward Street were approved. Scheduled for public hearing were TC 618, the Cottage Court text change, and CP 1019, Falls News Parkway. They'll both be heard on November 6th. TC 1219, unsafe buildings, was scheduled for public hearing on November 19th. TCZ 319, Glen Avenue, was scheduled for public hearing on December 3rd. For 2 items, the public hearings continued to the afternoon meeting on November 6th. That was the 1119 on Grove Avenue and TC 1119 shopping centers. Public hearing for Z719 was continued to the evening meeting on November 6th, and the item remains in Transportation and Transit Committee. Council authorized a text change to amend conditions associated with Z818 located at 2923 Edwards Mill Road, so that'll be coming to you. At their next meeting, the council is going to authorize, do something kind of unusual. They're going to authorize a text change and also schedule the public hearing for the very same text change, even though they will have not received your report. The reason is a matter of some urgency. Since the early summer, late spring, early summer, an issue was identified with the code as related to provisions for design adjustments for Chapter 8 of the UDO. Decisions being made administratively were determined by the city attorney to be quasi-judicial in nature. That required them to go directly to the Board of Adjustment for hearings, and that has dramatically expanded the number of items on the Board of Adjustment agenda because there is a huge number of design adjustments applied for, particularly for the block perimeter standards. And so a text change has been an early text change to just allow the Board of Adjustment to hear these cases based on the standards for approval in the UDO was passed relatively quickly, but the workload issue has not been addressed to date, and we have been working very hard between planning and the attorney's office to develop a text change that will create administrative exceptions for the vast majority of cases while still preserving the intent of the block perimeter standards, and there will, for those cases that fall through the cracks where their regulatory relief might be appropriate, but it requires a public hearing, the ordinance provides for that as well. But the idea is that this ordinance will deal with what has become a real problem in terms of caseload at the Board of Adjustment, and so there's a desire to move as quickly with it as possible. There has been some vetting that's occurred that's a little bit outside the norm for a text change drafting process because of the need to move quickly. And I would just commend it as a joint effort of the Attorney's Office, Development Services, Planning, and Transportation have all had their fingers in this pie, taking a very careful look at what has turned out to be a fairly complex but effective text change to deal with the issue.
Yeah, I'd say too, David York is here, I think, attorney. He's been helping our office with this. Like Ken said, it's been a big undertaking. So you'll probably see him there's gonna be a series of text amendments you'll see, and so I think we just wanted to let you know that they're coming. And it's related to creating these objective standards. What you'll see at the next meeting is Article 8.3, block perimeter, cross-access, stub streets. There will be 2 more. There's 8.4 and 8.5. As Ken, it's harder than you think to make an objective standard and try to anticipate everything. So staff's done a good job. They've shared it with the development community, received input. And as Ken mentioned, there's several cases right now at the Board of Adjustment, which is why we are doing this unusual process to get it go forward. So anyway, I would encourage you when you guys get the draft text amendment ahead of the meeting, if you have any questions that you would like staff to be able to answer at the meeting, anything at all, then please feel free to email me, Ken, Travis, so we can make sure those are answered for you.
Okay.
And again, there's going to be a series of 3 of them, so maybe 2, but you'll see a couple of them. They're all going to be related to creating these objective standards. And you'll also see in there, to the extent that staff cannot create an objective standard, so we had some standards, for example, water course. When does crossing a water course become something that's too difficult to do to justify doing it with your development proposal? Well, it's hard to come down on. It's one of those, when you see it, you know it kind of things. So staff's also worked on this additional quasi-judicial option to give some standards that are not a variance hardship standard, but are standards that go to the intent of the ordinance. I think what the plan is currently is actually to keep us at the Board of Adjustment until we're done with all of this design adjustment standard, and then to consider what to do with that and at that point. So
that blends nicely into the pending items. Are we expecting these text changes to begin showing up in November at our text change committee?
You will see the one that's drafted will be, so here's what, It's going to be on your regular agenda at the next.
On the 12th.
On the 12th.
And then we have a text change committee on the 19th, so if we want to fully discuss it, that would be a place to do it.
If you wanted to, that would be the way to do it. Again, I would say also, if you guys have any questions that you want staff to answer on the 12th, then please, any questions, let us know beforehand, so we can try to give you ample information.
Because we have a very open agenda on the text change committee. Nothing's listed there, so it'd be a good time to actually work through it. I know, strangely. All right, so keep that in mind as well as you ponder this text change that comes to us.
They're going to set a public hearing, but we will see this and have some chance to kick it around, but we need to get it out of here before the public hearing, right?
Right, so it's, I mean, I guess that you
That
guys
that is the goal.
I think you're going to have 3 opportunities to see it. So we will see it on the 12th.
Could be the 19th, possibly.
And then 19th text change committee.
And then the 26th, if there's a meeting on the 26th.
There's a possibility that you have additional time there to discuss. And we're going to send out the text change well in advance of the publication of the agenda. Our goal is to have it done a week early.
I'm moving approval already.
All right, so moving on to pending items. So we have items on the agenda for Committee of the Whole on Thursday, so there will be a very full evening of Committee of the Whole, probably the whole 2 hours, 3 hours. We go 4 to 7. So be prepared.
Well, it's even worse than that. We have a Transportation Committee meeting at 2:45, and we're going to continue our discussion about BRT planning. Jason, is he still here? No, he and I went to
He's
the...
here.
The
Other Jason, sorry.
Went to the Citizens for Transit Now meeting, or whatever it was the Wake Up Wake County sponsored transit group, and had a really very interesting, to me, and I think Jason did a very good job of presenting the issues of equity around BRT and other transit stations. What I asked him to do is help us come to grips with those same issues in the hour that we have on Thursday.
Okay. Thank you. Anything else? We stand adjourned.